The morning after the fall of Demadrius does not bring peace. It brings clarity, and clarity in wartime is a far more dangerous thing than confusion, because confusion allows men to hope that the picture is not as dire as it appears, whereas clarity strips that comfort away and leaves nothing but the naked geometry of what must be done and what it will cost, and who will pay that cost in the currency that war has always preferred above all others. The Sultan stands in the great hall of the fortress, and around him the evidence of conquest arranges itself in the particular order that victors impose upon the chaos of battle. Captured weapons are stacked against the walls in neat rows that make the instruments of death look almost decorative, like the trophies of a hunt rather than the tools of a slaughter. Prisoners sit in lines along the far wall, their wrists bound, their heads bowed, their eyes fixed on the flagstones between their feet as though searching for answers in the patterns of the stone. Officers move through the hall with dispatches and reports and the thousand small administrative tasks that follow every military engagement, the paperwork of carnage, the bureaucracy of blood. Avronos enters the hall with a map rolled under his arm, and behind him walks Burhan Faladios, whose armor still carries the dents and scratches of the fighting in the western tower, and whose face wears the particular expression of a man who has killed enough for one night, and would prefer to spend the morning thinking about something other than killing, but who knows, with the resigned certainty of a professional soldier, that the morning will not grant him that preference. They approach the Sultan, and Avronos unrolls the map on the great table that occupies the center of the hall, a table whose surface bears the scars of centuries of war councils and peace negotiations, and the meals of commanders who ate and planned and argued and decided the fates of thousands while the gravy cooled on their plates. Avronos says, "My Sultan, the fortress is ours, but the situation beyond these walls demands immediate attention. Shahanshah's raiding parties, the ones he sent to burn our villages, they are still in the field. The villages to the north, Karahisar, Mudanya, and the settlements along the Bithynian ridge, they have been hit. The fires we saw yesterday were only the beginning. Our scouts report that at least 3 raiding columns are still operational, each numbering between 40 and 60 mounted soldiers, and they are moving fast, striking settlements and withdrawing before any defensive force can respond." The Sultan studies the map. His finger traces the line of settlements that runs along the northern approach to the fortress, a string of villages that exists in the contested space between Ottoman and Byzantine influence, villages whose loyalties shift with the seasons and whose people have learned, through generations of living on the frontier, that the only reliable allegiance is the allegiance to survival. These are the people Shahanshah targeted. These are the lives he calculated were worth spending to buy himself time. And the Sultan looks at the marks on the map that indicate burned villages and scattered populations, and his jaw sets with the particular tension of a man who has been given one more reason to pursue a reckoning that was already inevitable. He says, "Tarhan." And Tarhan steps forward from where he has been standing near the entrance to the hall, his arms crossed, his sword cleaned and resheathed, his body carrying the particular stillness of a predator that has fed recently but whose appetite is not yet fully satisfied. He says, "My Sultan." The Sultan says, "Take 300 cavalry, find these raiding parties, every single one. I want them destroyed, not scattered, not driven off, destroyed. I want every man who burned a house or terrorized a family or raised his hand against anyone who could not fight back to understand in the final moments of his life that there exists in this world a force that will find him no matter where he runs and will deliver upon him a justice so complete that even the crows will turn away from what remains." Tarhan nods. He does not speak because the instruction requires no verbal acknowledgement. The look that passes between him and the Sultan is sufficient. It is the look of 2 men who have communicated in this shorthand for so long that words have become a redundancy, an ornament rather than a necessity. Tarhan turns and leaves the hall, and within the hour, the sound of 300 horses thundering through the fortress gate and across the drawbridge fills the morning air like a storm breaking over the mountains. And then the sound fades as the column disappears into the dust of the northern road, and the silence that follows is the silence of things being set in motion that cannot be stopped. Abdul Rahman is in the courtyard when Tarhan departs. He watches the cavalry column pass through the gate, and each rider that passes him nods or raises a hand or simply meets his eyes with the wordless salute of men who know what he did last night on the cliff face, and who carry that knowledge like a private treasure, a piece of evidence that the impossible is merely the untried. Abdul Rahman returns each acknowledgement with a slight inclination of his head, and then, when the last rider has passed and the dust is settling and the courtyard returns to the particular quiet of a space that has seen too much activity to ever be truly peaceful, he turns and walks toward the eastern wall. He walks the route he climbed in darkness, this time in daylight, and the daylight reveals what the darkness concealed. The ledge is narrower than he remembered. In several places it is barely wide enough for a single foot, the stone crumbling at the edges, the drop beneath it so sheer and so absolute that looking down creates a sensation not of fear but of unreality, as though the brain simply refuses to accept the information the eyes are providing. He stands on the battlement and looks down at the ledge and the cliff and the sea far below, and he thinks, I climbed that, in the dark, with 20 men behind me, and none of us fell. He touches the stone beneath his armor, Alina's stone, and he thinks of her not with the desperate longing of separation, but with the quiet gratitude of a man who knows that somewhere in the world there is a person who gave him a piece of themselves to carry. And that piece, that small, warm, luminous piece, was the difference between climbing and falling, between reaching the top and joining the bones at the bottom of the cliff. He is interrupted by footsteps behind him, and he turns to find Fatima approaching. She walks with the careful deliberation of a woman whose body is still recovering from days of captivity, the stiffness in her joints betraying the cramped conditions of the prisoner cart, the rawness of her wrists where the chains bit into flesh serving as a visible reminder of what she endured. But her eyes are clear, her spine is straight. And her voice when she speaks carries the particular authority of a woman who has looked into the face of her own helplessness and emerged from that confrontation not diminished but refined, the way fire refines metal, burning away everything that is not essential and leaving behind only the pure, hard, unbreakable core. She says, Abdul Rahman, I did not have the opportunity to speak with you properly after the rescue. The chaos of the battle, the march to the fortress, everything moved so quickly that the words I wanted to say were lost in the noise. So I am saying them now. You saved my life, you saved Avronos's life, and in doing so you gave my brother the freedom to act without the chain of our captivity around his neck. What you did in the valley of Sarihan was not merely an act of military skill. It was an act of grace, and I will not forget it. Abdul Rahman bows his head and says, the grace belongs to the Almighty Fatima Khatan. I was merely the instrument he chose to wield. Fatima studies him for a moment, and the hint of a smile crosses her face, the first smile she has allowed herself since the chains were placed on her wrists. She says, an instrument does not choose to climb a cliff in the dark, Abdul Rahman. An instrument does not stand in a doorway and hold it against 30 men. An instrument does not carry a stone given by a woman against his heart into battle. Do not diminish what you are by attributing it entirely to forces beyond yourself. The Almighty works through men, yes, but he chooses carefully which men he works through, and he chose you. She turns and walks away, leaving Abdul Rahman alone on the battlement with the wind and the stone and the sea and the knowledge that what she said is true. And the weight of that truth, the responsibility it implies, the standard it sets for every action he will take from this moment forward, settles onto his shoulders like a mantle that he did not ask for but that he will wear without complaint for as long as the wearing is required. In the dungeon beneath the inner keep, the morning brings its own particular brand of illumination. Light enters through narrow slits in the stone walls, thin blades of sunshine that cut across the cell floors at angles that shift as the day progresses, tracking the sun's movement across the sky like the hands of a clock that measures not hours but the remaining time in the lives of those who sit beneath it. Yaqid has not moved from his position against the wall. The blankness that characterized his expression in the immediate aftermath of the fortress's fall has been replaced by something more complex, a churning, unstable mixture of rage and calculation and self-pity that manifests in the constant movement of his eyes, darting from the cell door to the window slit to the guards back to the ceiling, and then starting the circuit again, searching for something, anything, that might offer a way out of the predicament that his own choices have constructed around him. In the adjacent cell, Difne has been more productive. She has examined every stone in the walls, tested every bar in the door, studied the guard rotation with the methodical patience of a woman who treats captivity not as a condition but as a problem. And every problem in Difne's experience has a solution if you are willing to look hard enough and think long enough and sacrifice enough to reach it. She has found nothing yet. The cells are well constructed. The guards are disciplined. The bars are solid iron set deep into stone that has been hardened by centuries of salt air. But Difne is not discouraged. Discouragement is a luxury she has never been able to afford because the life she has lived, the things she has done, the lines she has crossed, required the complete elimination of any internal mechanism that might cause her to stop and question and doubt. She functions on the principle that forward motion is survival and stillness is death, and so she continues to move, even when the movement is purely mental, even when the only journey available to her is the journey through the labyrinth of her own intelligence, searching for the thread that will lead her out. She speaks through the wall to Yaqid, her voice low enough that the guard cannot hear it over the sound of his own breathing. She says, stop feeling sorry for yourself, Yaqid. Self-pity is a weight that drowns men who would otherwise swim. We are not dead, we are not injured. We are captive, and captivity is a temporary condition for anyone who refuses to accept it as permanent. Yaqid's voice comes back through the wall, bitter and hollow. He says, you speak as though escape is merely a matter of will. Look around you, Difne. These walls are not persuaded by determination. These bars do not bend to conviction. We are here because the world has decided we belong here, and the world, in my experience, does not often change its mind. Difne says the world does not change its mind because men like you wait for it to change instead of reaching up and turning it yourself. Listen to me. When they bring us before the Sultan, and they will, because the Sultan is not a man who kills his enemies in cellars, but a man who pronounces judgment in the light of day where everyone can witness it. When they bring us before him, we will have one chance. One moment in which the door is open and the guard's attention is divided, and the distance between captivity and freedom is measured not in miles but in steps. When that moment comes, be ready. Yakid says nothing, but his eyes, which had been making their circuit of the cell with the mechanical regularity of a trapped animal's packing, slow and then stop, and they fix on the wall through which Difne's voice came, and in them is the first flicker of something that is not quite hope, but is at least the recognition that despair is not the only option available. Above them in the great hall, the Sultan convenes his war council. The commanders gather around the great table with its scarred surface and its map now covered in new markings, new arrows, new positions, new threats and opportunities identified by Evronos's tireless analysis and verified by the scouts who have been ranging across the countryside since before dawn. The Sultan stands at the head of the table, and his presence organizes the room the way a lodestone organizes iron filings, drawing every eye and every attention toward a single point of focus. He says Demadrias is taken, but Demadrias is not the war. Demadrias is a position, a strong position, a useful position, but a position nonetheless. And positions are won and lost with the regularity of tides. What we must secure is not a fortress but a future. And the future lies not behind these walls but beyond them, in the territory that stretches from here to the borders of the empire that sent those ships in the harbor, the empire that backed Shahanshah because it served their interests to have a buffer between their lands and ours, the empire that will not accept the loss of this fortress without response. Evronos takes over, his voice carrying the particular cadence of a man who has been thinking about this problem for days and who has arrived at conclusions that he delivers not as opinions but as facts. He says the emperor will respond. The question is not whether but how and when. The Byzantine fleet in the harbor has withdrawn to open water, but it has not departed. It sits beyond arrow range, watching, waiting, reporting everything it sees to Constantinople. Within a week, perhaps less, the emperor will have a complete picture of what happened here, and he will make a decision. That decision will be one of three things. He will send a diplomatic mission to negotiate the return of the fortress, which we will refuse. He will send a larger army to retake the fortress by force, which we must be prepared to repel. Or he will accept the loss and adjust his strategy, redirecting his resources to other frontiers, which would be the best outcome for us but the least likely, because empires do not accept losses gracefully. It is not in their nature. The Sultan says, and what do you recommend? Evronos says we fortify. We repair the damage from last night's assault. We stockpile supplies. We establish a garrison capable of holding these walls against a force 3 times its size. And we send word to every allied tribe and every sympathetic lord between here and the eastern mountains that the fortress of Demadrias is now Ottoman, and that any Byzantine army that approaches it will find itself facing not a garrison but an alliance. Orhan Faladios speaks up. He says there is also the matter of Yakid. His voice carries a particular edge when he says the name, the edge of a man whose personal animosity toward the traitor has been sharpened by days of watching Yakid's manipulations cause suffering to people Burhan cares about. He says Yakid's network of informants and collaborators is still active. Even with him in a cell, the people he cultivated, the Byzantine sympathizers he recruited, the corrupt officials he bribed, they are still out there. They are still passing information. They are still working against us. Cutting the head from a snake is meaningless if the body continues to move. The Sultan says Yakid will be dealt with. His network will be dismantled. Mahmud, you will take responsibility for this. Root out every agent, every informant, every collaborator that Yakid placed in our territory. Use whatever methods are necessary, but understand this: I want intelligence, not corpses. Dead agents tell us nothing. Living agents, properly motivated, tell us everything. Mahmud nods. He is a man of few words and many capabilities, and the assignment sits comfortably on his shoulders like a garment that was tailored specifically for him. The Sultan continues. He says, Damir Khan, what is his status? Abdul Rahman says Darsan has him in custody. The reports indicate that Damir Khan was subdued in the forest and that his forces have been broken. Darsan has assumed control of the chieftainship and the tribal council has ratified his claim. Damir Khan is wounded but alive. Darsan is bringing him here. The Sultan says, when Darsan arrives, I will speak with him. The tribal matters are his to resolve, but the strategic implications belong to all of us. A divided tribe on our northern flank is a vulnerability we cannot afford. Darsan must consolidate his authority quickly and completely, and if Damir Khan's supporters resist, they must be given a choice that allows them to accept the new reality with whatever dignity they can salvage. Altuddin Saheb, who has been standing near the window listening to the exchange with the particular attentiveness of a man whose counsel is offered rarely but weighted heavily when it arrives, speaks for the first time. He says, "My Sultan, there is another matter that requires attention. The villages that Shahanshah ordered burned. The people who were displaced. They are on the roads now, moving south toward our territory, carrying nothing but what they could grab before the fires consumed their homes. They need food. They need shelter. They need the knowledge that the power which is supposed to protect them has not abandoned them. If we fail to provide these things, we win the fortress but lose the people, and a fortress without people is a stone on a hill, impressive to look at but ultimately meaningless." The Sultan nods, and his nod carries the weight of a man who needed to hear this truth spoken aloud even though he already knew it. He says, "Altuddin, you will coordinate the relief effort, take supplies from the fortress stores, establish camps along the southern road, find the displaced families and bring them under our protection. And tell every single one of them that the Sultan of the Ottomans knows what was done to them and that the men who did it will answer for it before God and before the law." Altuddin bows and leaves the hall, his stride carrying the purposeful energy of a man who has been given a task that aligns not merely with his orders but with his deepest convictions about what leadership means and what those who wield power owe to those who endure it. The War Council continues through the morning and into the afternoon, each topic flowing into the next with the relentless momentum of water finding its way downhill. Defensive positions are analyzed, supply lines are mapped, communication routes are established. Contingency plans are developed for scenarios ranging from a full Byzantine naval assault to a diplomatic mission to the unlikely but not impossible event that the emperor decides to deploy his feared Greek fire against the fortress. A weapon so terrible that its mere mention changes the atmosphere in the room the way a storm changes the atmosphere of a summer afternoon. Through all of this, the Sultan listens more than he speaks, absorbing information, weighing options, building in his mind a picture of the strategic landscape that is so detailed and so comprehensive that it functions almost as a second reality, a mental model of the world upon which he can run simulations and test hypotheses and anticipate the moves of enemies who do not yet know what moves they will make. This is his gift, not the sword, although he wields it well. Not the horse, although he rides it better than most. His gift is the ability to see the board from above, to perceive patterns in the chaos, to understand that every action taken by every player in this vast, blood-soaked game is connected to every other action by threads of cause and effect that stretch backward into history and forward into a future that is being written in real time by the decisions made in rooms like this one. As the afternoon wanes, a commotion at the gate announces a new arrival. Soldiers call out, officers shout orders, and through the gate, riding at the head of a column that is part military escort and part prisoner convoy, comes Darsan. He rides like a man who has been transformed. The last time the Sultan saw Darsan, he was a subordinate, a younger brother, a man defined more by what he lacked: authority, confidence, the right to speak his own name without looking over his shoulder for permission, than by what he possessed. That man is gone. The man who rides through the gate of Demadrias carries himself with the upright bearing of someone who has fought for the right to be who he is, and who will never again allow anyone to define him in terms of his relation to another. His eyes scan the courtyard with the assessing gaze of a leader who automatically evaluates every space he enters for threats and advantages. His hand rests on his sword hilt not with anxiety but with the casual familiarity of a man who has recently used that weapon to settle the most important argument of his life and who knows, with certainty, that the settlement was just. Behind him, bound and mounted on a horse led by Mustafa, rides Damir Khan. The former chieftain is diminished, not merely physically, although the wounds Darsan inflicted are visible in the bandages wrapped around his torso and his arm and the side of his face where a blade passed close enough to leave a scar that will mark him for the rest of his life. He is diminished in a more fundamental way, the way a fire is diminished when its fuel is exhausted. The rage that sustained him, the ambition that drove him, the pride that armored him against the consequences of his own cruelty, all of it has been burned away, and what remains is the ash of a man who waged war against his own blood and lost. Darsan dismounts and approaches the Sultan, and when he kneels, the Sultan takes his arm and raises him immediately, a gesture that communicates more than any words could about the respect the Sultan has for what Darsan has accomplished and what Darsan has endured to accomplish it. The Sultan says, "Darsan chieftain, welcome." And the use of the title is deliberate, a public ratification of Darsan's new status delivered in the hearing of every soldier and officer in the courtyard, ensuring that no one, not today, not tomorrow, not ever, will question the legitimacy of Darsan's authority. Darsan says, "My Sultan, I bring my brother before you, not as a gift and not as an offering, but as a matter of justice that exceeds my authority to resolve alone. He waged war against your people. He allied with your enemies. He divided a tribe that was supposed to serve as your shield against threats from the north. The tribal matters I have settled, but the crimes against your sovereignty are yours to judge." The Sultan looks past Darsan at Damir Khan, who sits on his horse with his head bowed, the bandages on his face slowly darkening with fresh blood from wounds that have been aggravated by the ride. The Sultan says, "Bring him to the hall. He will answer for what he has done, but he will answer tomorrow. Tonight you will eat, you will rest, you will sit with your men and allow them to see that their new chieftain is a man who commands not through fear, but through the example of his own conduct." That is the foundation upon which all lasting authority is built, Darsan, not the sword, not the fist, the example. Darsan nods, and the nod carries gratitude and relief and the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a burden so heavy that he has forgotten what it feels like to stand straight, and who now, for the first time in days, allows himself to feel the weight of that burden lifting, not completely, not yet, but enough to remind him that lightness exists and that he will experience it again. The evening comes, and with it a stillness that settles over the fortress like snow falling on a battlefield, covering the blood and the broken things with a layer of white silence that does not erase what lies beneath, but that makes it possible, for a few hours at least, to look at the world without seeing the damage. In the great hall, the commanders eat together, not a feast. The supplies do not permit a feast, and the mood does not warrant one. But there is food, simple food, bread and dried meat and water and the thin, bitter coffee that soldiers drink not for pleasure but for the clarity it brings to minds that have been dulled by exhaustion and stress. They sit around the great table and they eat and they talk, not of strategy or tactics or the war that surrounds them, but of other things, smaller things, the things that remind them that they are human beings who exist outside the context of conflict. Tarhin tells a story about a horse he once owned that could find its way home from any distance, no matter how far he rode it, and how one day he discovered that the horse was not navigating by landmarks or scent, but by following the call of a particular rooster in his village, a rooster whose crow carried farther than any other roosters for reasons that no one, not even the village elder, could explain. The story makes Burhan Faladios laugh, and the laugh is startling in this room, startling the way a flower growing through a crack in a ruin is startling, evidence of something persistent and irrepressible in the human spirit that no amount of war can fully suppress. Abdul Rahman sits apart from the group, near the window where the night air enters the hall carrying the scent of the sea and the sound of the waves breaking against the cliff below the eastern wall. He holds Alina's stone in his hand, turning it slowly, watching the lamplight move across its surface in patterns that suggest meaning without quite achieving it. He thinks of her. He thinks of the window in Bursa where she might be standing at this very moment, looking out at a city that is not her home, holding in her heart the image of a man she gave a stone to on a moonlit shore. He wonders if she can feel, across the distance that separates them, the warmth that the stone generates against his palm. He wonders if she knows, through some mechanism of the heart that transcends geography and time, that he climbed a cliff with her stone against his chest and opened a gate that was supposed to remain closed forever. He does not know the answers to these questions, but the questions themselves are a comfort because they belong to a category of human experience that war cannot touch, the category that includes love and longing and the particular grace that comes from carrying another person's essence close to your body and drawing strength from it in moments when your own strength has been exhausted. Bursa, as though summoned by the force of his thinking, Alina stands at her window. She cannot see the fortress of Demadrias from here. She cannot see the cliff or the sea or the battlement where Abdul Rahman sat that morning examining the ledge he climbed in darkness. She can see only the rooftops of the city and the sky above them, a sky that carries the same stars that Abdul Rahman can see from his window in the fortress, the same moon, the same darkness pierced by the same points of ancient, indifferent light. And she places her hand against her chest where the stone used to rest, where its absence creates a hollowness that is not empty but full of the memory of giving it away, full of the knowledge that the part of herself she placed in that stone is now traveling through the world in the keeping of a man whose face she sees every time she closes her eyes. Nilufar finds her in the corridor the next morning. The two women, one Ottoman royalty and the other a dispossessed Byzantine princess, face each other across a gap that is simultaneously vast and narrow, the gap between cultures, between faiths, between the worlds they were born into and the world they now share. Nilüfer studies Alina with the perceptive eye of a woman who has learned to read the faces of others the way scholars read books, extracting meaning from the arrangement of features and the quality of light in the eyes and the particular way the corners of the mouth settle when the face is at rest. Nilüfer says, "You think of him constantly." It is not a question. Alina does not treat it as one. She says, "Is it so obvious?" Nilüfer says, "It is obvious to someone who thinks of her own man constantly. The signs are the same regardless of who we are or where we come from. The distance in the eyes, the way the hand moves to the chest without conscious direction, reaching for something that is not there. The way the breath changes when his name is spoken, not by you but by someone else, catching in the throat for just a moment before continuing. These are the marks of love across distance, Alina. I know them well because I wear them myself." Alina says, "You are kind. I did not expect kindness here." Nilüfer says, "What did you expect?" And Alina is quiet for a moment before she answers. She says, "I expected to be tolerated. Kindness was not something I allowed myself to hope for. The world I came from, the courts of the Byzantine governors, kindness was a currency that had been devalued long ago. What passed for kindness in those courts was usually a prelude to manipulation, a hand extended not in friendship but in expectation of future servitude. I learned to suspect every gentle word and to brace for the demand that inevitably followed it. Coming here, I carried that suspicion with me like armor. And now I find that the armor is unnecessary, and I do not know what to do with my hands without it." Nilüfer smiles, and the smile carries the warmth of a woman who understands precisely what Alina is describing because she has seen it before. In other women who have come to this household carrying the scars of other worlds, other courts, other systems of power that treated kindness as weakness and suspicion as strength. She says, "You will learn what to do with your hands. You will learn it the way we all learn it, slowly, clumsily, making mistakes, reaching for things that are not there and finding things that are. And in the meantime, you are welcome here, not tolerated. Welcome, there is a difference, and the difference matters." They walk together through the palace, and the conversation that follows is not recorded here because it belongs to the private realm of women's communication, the realm where the things that matter most are spoken in the language of shared experience rather than the language of narrative, where understanding is achieved not through exposition, but through the particular alchemy that occurs when two human beings recognize in each other the reflection of their own deepest fears and hopes and choose. Despite everything the world has taught them about the dangers of trust, to lower their defenses and speak plainly. Malhan Khatun observes this developing friendship from a distance, and she observes it with approval, because Malhan Khatun is a woman who understands that the strength of a household, like the strength of a fortress, is measured not by the thickness of its walls but by the bonds between the people who live within them. She watches Nilüfer and Alina walk together through the garden, their heads inclined toward each other in the universal posture of women sharing confidences, and she nods to herself, and the nod says, "This is how we survive. Not through swords and fortresses and the machinery of war, but through this. Through the simple, radical, world-changing act of offering kindness to someone who expected none." Back at Demadria's, the morning brings the moment that the dungeon's occupants have been simultaneously dreading and anticipating. Guards arrive at Yakid's cell and order him to his feet. The same guards arrive at Difne's cell and issue the same command. They are brought up from the dungeons through corridors that Yakid knows well, corridors he walked as a free man mere days ago, corridors whose stones remember the sound of his confident footsteps and now hear the shuffle of his shackled ones. And the contrast between those two sounds is a commentary on the fragility of human fortune that no historian needs to elaborate upon because the stones themselves tell the story. They are brought into the great hall. The Sultan sits at the head of the table. His commanders flank him on either side. Evronos stands to his left. Burhan Faladios stands to his right. Abdul Rahman stands near the window where the morning light falls across his shoulders like a mantle of gold. Fatima stands near the door, her wrists still bearing the marks of chains, her presence a silent testimony to the crimes of the people being brought before the court. Darsan stands beside his brother Damir Khan, who has been brought from his own confinement to witness the proceedings, though whether as a fellow accused or as an observer whose own judgment will come later is not yet clear. Yakid enters the hall, and the change in him is striking. The swagger that characterized his movements in the days of his freedom has been replaced by a careful, measured gait that speaks not of caution, but of the particular self-consciousness of a man who knows that every eye in the room is evaluating him and finding him wanting. His face has thinned. The hours in the cell have stripped away whatever softness his features possessed, leaving behind the hard, angular geometry of bones too close to the surface and skin too tight across the skull. His eyes, which were once bright with the particular intelligence of a man who sees opportunity in every situation, are dulled now, the light behind them dimmed not by defeat but by the recognition that the intelligence he prided himself on was never truly intelligence at all but merely cunning. And cunning, divorced from wisdom, is nothing more than the ability to build elaborate structures that inevitably collapse upon the builder. Difna enters behind him, and she is different. Where Yakid has diminished, Difna has contracted, drawing her energy inward, conserving it, the way a predator that has been caged conserves its strength for the moment when the cage door opens. Her eyes are not dulled. They are sharp, scanning the room with the rapid, comprehensive assessment of a woman who is already calculating escape routes and identifying the weakest link in the chain of authority that surrounds her. She is, in this moment, more dangerous than Yakid has ever been because she has been stripped of everything except her essential nature, and her essential nature is survival. The Sultan looks at them, and his gaze carries the weight of every crime they have committed and every consequence those crimes have produced. He says, Yakid, and the name falls into the silence of the hall like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples spread outward until they touch every wall. Yakid raises his eyes to meet the Sultan's, and in that meeting of gazes is the collision of two fundamentally incompatible worldviews. The worldview of a man who believes that power is justified by the good it serves, and the worldview of a man who believes that power is justified by the mere fact of possessing it. The Sultan says, you stand before this court accused of treason. Treason against your people, treason against your oath, treason against the bonds of trust that hold a civilization together and without which no fortress, no army, no empire can endure. You conspired with the enemies of your own nation. You provided them with intelligence that cost the lives of your own countrymen. You participated in the capture and imprisonment of Fatima Khatun and Evronos, citizens under my protection, subjects of my authority. You facilitated Shahanshah's campaign of terror against our villages, a campaign that resulted in the destruction of homes and the displacement of families whose only crime was living in the path of an ambition that recognized no boundary between combatant and civilian. He pauses. The silence in the hall is so complete that the sound of the waves breaking against the cliff far below can be heard through the stone walls, a rhythmic, relentless sound that seems to mark the passage of time in a cadence that belongs not to the world of men but to the world of elements, of water and stone and the endless negotiation between them. The Sultan continues. He says, what do you say in answer to these charges? Yakid standing in chains before the man whose authority he betrayed, the man whose trust he violated, the man whose people he helped terrorize, does something unexpected. He laughs. It is not a laugh of amusement or defiance or madness. It is the laugh of a man who has arrived at a truth so bitter that the only response available to him is the convulsive, involuntary sound that the human body makes when the mind encounters something it cannot process through any rational channel. He says, what would you have me say, Sultan? That I am sorry. I am not sorry. That I regret what I did. I do not regret it. I regret that it failed. I regret that the men I allied with were too weak and too stupid to hold what I gave them. I regret that I placed my future in the hands of people whose incompetence was exceeded only by their cowardice. But the choices I made, I would make again. Because the world you are building, the world of your justice and your faith and your righteous authority, that world has no place for men like me. It never did. And I refuse to disappear quietly into the margins of your glory while you and your loyal followers divided the future among yourselves and left men like me to fight over the scraps. The hall absorbs these words the way stone absorbs rain, silently, completely, without visible effect on the surface but with consequences that work themselves out slowly in the depths. The commanders exchange glances. Orhan Faladios's hand moves to his sword hilt and then stops, restrained by the knowledge that the Sultan's court is not the place for summary justice, however much Barhan's instincts might prefer it. Fatima speaks. She steps forward from her position near the door and addresses not the Sultan but Yakid directly, and her voice carries the particular coldness of a woman whose patience has been exhausted by a man who has spent years testing it. She says, there was a place for you, Yakid. There was always a place. But the place that was offered was not enough for you, because the place that was offered required you to be something you have never been willing to be, honest. You were given trust and you betrayed it. You were given responsibility and you corrupted it. You were given a seat at a table surrounded by people who wanted nothing from you except loyalty, the simplest and most fundamental of all human obligations, and you could not provide it because loyalty requires the capacity to value something more than yourself, and you have never valued anything more than yourself. She pauses, and when she continues, her voice drops lower and the lower register carries more menace than any shout. She says, you stood over me while I was in chains and mocked me. You questioned my judgment for loving a man who, for all his faults, has never once betrayed the people who trusted him. You called Evronos a dog, but a dog, Yakid, a dog is loyal. A dog returns to its master even when its master strikes it. A dog does not calculate the angle of its betrayal. A dog does not lie with a smile on its face. If Evronos is a dog, then you are something lower than a dog, something that dogs themselves would refuse to associate with. The words strike Yakid like physical blows, and each one leaves a mark that is not visible on his face but that can be detected in the subtle changes in his posture. the slight forward hunch of his shoulders, the almost imperceptible lowering of his chin, the gradual collapse of whatever internal architecture was still supporting the fiction that he is, in some fundamental way, justified in what he did. The Sultan raises his hand and Fatima steps back. The Sultan says, Yaqid, your words have confirmed what your actions already proved. You are a traitor not by accident but by choice, not by weakness but by conviction. And a man who betrays by conviction cannot be reformed because there is nothing broken in him to repair. He is functioning exactly as he was designed to function. The fault lies not in his mechanism but in his purpose. He turns to his guards and says, take him back to his cell. His judgment will be rendered when the time is appropriate. The Sultan does not say when that time will be, and the absence of a specific deadline is itself a form of punishment, the torment of uncertainty, the particular cruelty of not knowing whether the next dawn will be your last, not knowing whether the footsteps in the corridor bring food or a sentence, not knowing anything except that you are entirely at the mercy of a man whose mercy you did everything in your power to ensure you do not deserve. Yaqid is led away. Difne follows, her eyes still scanning, still calculating, still searching for the moment that she told Yaqid about, the moment when the door is open and the guard's attention is divided and the distance between captivity and freedom is measured in steps rather than miles. That moment has not come, but Difne is patient. She has survived worse than this, and she will survive this too, because survival is not merely what she does, it is what she is. The hall empties slowly after the proceedings. The commanders drift away to their various duties. Evronos returns to the eastern wall to oversee the repairs. Orhan Faladios descends to the courtyard to drill the garrison troops, because a fortress that has been taken must immediately begin preparing to be defended, and the discipline that wins battles is maintained not in battle but in the hours between battles, the hours of repetition and practice, and the incremental perfection of skills that must function flawlessly under conditions that permit no margin for error. The Sultan remains in the hall alone. He stands at the window that overlooks the harbor and he watches the Byzantine ships that still sit at anchor beyond arrow range, their sails furled, their crews visible as tiny figures moving on the distant decks. He watches them and he thinks, and the thoughts he thinks are not the thoughts of triumph or satisfaction or even relief. They are the thoughts of a man who has won a battle and who knows, with the certainty that only experience can provide, that the winning of battles is the easiest part of the enterprise he has committed himself to. The hard part is what comes after, the rebuilding, the reconciliation, the transformation of enemies into subjects and subjects into citizens and citizens into the foundation of something that will outlast the man who built it. He thinks of the villages that burned. He thinks of the families on the roads, carrying their children and their fear and whatever possessions they managed to salvage from the flames. He thinks of Altadin out there somewhere on the southern road, organizing relief, distributing food, telling people that the Sultan knows what happened to them and that the men who did it will answer for it. He hopes that Altadin's words carry the weight he intends them to carry. He hopes that the people who hear them believe them. He hopes that trust, once broken, can be repaired, although he knows from experience that trust is like a bone, it can heal after being broken, but the place where it broke is never quite the same, never quite as strong, always carrying within its structure the memory of the fracture. He thinks of Nilüfer. He thinks of the letters he wrote to her, one containing the news of the war and the other containing the news of his heart, and he wonders which one caused her more pain. He suspects it was the second one because the news of war is abstract, a report from a distant theater where things happen to other people. But the news of the heart is immediate and personal and strikes at the core of what two people are to each other. He wrote things in that letter that he has never said aloud, confessions of fear and loneliness and the particular terror that visits commanders in the dark hours before dawn, the terror not of death but of inadequacy, the fear that the decisions he makes will prove wrong in ways that cannot be corrected, that the lives entrusted to him will be spent on errors that history will record with merciless precision. He shakes these thoughts off. Not because they are unimportant, but because there is work to be done, and the work will not wait for the completion of his private reckoning with his own conscience. He turns from the window and walks out of the hall, and as he walks, the fortress seems to organize itself around his movement, soldiers straightening as he passes, officers pausing their conversations to acknowledge his presence, the machinery of command adjusting itself to the gravity of the man at its center. Outside in the courtyard, Tarhan has returned. He rode through the night with his 300 cavalry, hunting the raiding parties that Shahanshah sent to burn the villages, and his return tells the story before he opens his mouth. His horse is lathered. His sword is clean because Tarhan always cleans his sword before he returns to his commander, a habit of discipline that he has maintained since he first picked up a blade as a boy. But his armor carries the marks of engagement, the dents and scratches that accumulate on the surface of a man who has spent the night riding through darkness and finding, in that darkness, the men he was sent to find. He dismounts and approaches the Sultan, and his report is delivered in the clipped, efficient language that Tarhan always uses, language stripped of embellishment and emotion, language that communicates facts with the precision of a blade cutting through cloth. He says 3 raiding columns identified and engaged, First column intercepted north of Karahisar, 42 enemy combatants, all neutralized. Second column intercepted in the Bithynian Ridge Pass, 51 enemy combatants, all neutralized. Third column intercepted east of Mudanya, 38 enemy combatants attempting to regroup, all neutralized. Total enemy casualties 131. Ottoman casualties 7 wounded, none killed. The villages are secure, the fires are out, the people are returning to their homes. The Sultan listens to this report, and when it is finished, he places his hand on Tarhan's shoulder, the same gesture he used with Abdul Rahman, the gesture that communicates everything that needs to be said about trust and mission and the sacred compact between those who command and those who obey. He says, "Well done." And the two words, simple as they are, carry a weight that no elaborate praise could match, because they come from a man who does not offer them lightly and whose standards for what constitutes a job well done are higher than most men can reach. Tarhan nods and walks away to see to his men and his horses, and the Sultan watches him go. And for a moment, just a moment, the weight on his shoulders eases. Not because the problems have been solved, they have not. The Byzantine fleet still watches from the harbor. The emperor still sits in Constantinople planning his response. The displaced villagers still walk the roads. The traitor still sits in his cell. The war still stretches ahead like a road whose end is not visible from where they stand. But the villages are secure, the fires are out, the people are returning. And that for this moment is enough. The afternoon sun passes over the fortress and begins its descent toward the western sea, and the light changes from the harsh, revealing brightness of midday to the softer, more forgiving gold of late afternoon, the kind of light that makes even ruined things look beautiful, that gilds the broken edges and fills the cracks with warmth and reminds the world that beauty and destruction are not opposites but companions. Traveling together through the landscape of human experience like two riders on the same road who can never be separated because the road itself insists on their proximity. In the great hall, Shahanshah sits alone with his thoughts. He has been brought from his cell for a meal, a concession to his status as a former ruler, a recognition that even captured enemies retain certain dignities that the Sultan's court is obligated to respect. He eats slowly, without appetite, his eyes fixed on the mosaic above the fireplace that depicts a Byzantine emperor receiving the submission of a barbarian king, the barbarian kneeling, the emperor standing, the hierarchy of the image reinforcing a narrative that has been the foundation of Byzantine identity for 1,000 years, the narrative that civilization flows from Constantinople outward, and that everything beyond its walls is darkness waiting to be illuminated. Shahanshah looks at this mosaic and he sees himself in it, but he does not know whether he is the emperor or the barbarian. The question has become meaningless. The categories have dissolved. The wall between civilization and barbarism, between order and chaos, between the justified and the unjustified, has been breached as thoroughly as the walls of this fortress. And what pours through the gap is not the flood of one side into the other, but the recognition that both sides are, and have always been, made of the same material. He pushes his plate away. He stares at the wall, and the mosaic stares back unchanging, its colored glass eyes holding a judgment that was rendered centuries ago and that will never be amended, never be appealed, never be revised, because mosaics do not change their minds. They show what they show. They mean what they mean, and the meaning does not care whether the man looking at it agrees with it or not. Night falls on the fortress of Demadrias for the second time since its capture, and this night is quieter than the last. The sounds of battle have been replaced by the sounds of reconstruction, hammers and saws, and the voices of men working by torchlight to repair what the fighting damaged, to shore up what the fighting weakened, to rebuild what the fighting destroyed. The fortress is being transformed. Not just physically, although the physical transformation is significant. New flags on the towers, new guards at the gates, new symbols of authority carved into the stone above the entrance. The transformation is also spiritual, change in the character of the space, a shift in the meaning of the walls and the purpose they serve. These walls once protected the ambitions of a man who was willing to burn villages and terrorize civilians to maintain his grip on power. Now they protect something different. Something that the Sultan has spent his entire life building and defending and refining. Something that has no name in any language, but that can be recognized by its effects, by the way it makes people stand a little straighter when they are in its presence, by the way it makes soldiers willing to climb cliffs in the dark, by the way it makes women offer stones to men they barely know and trust that the offering will be honored. Abdul Rahman stands on the eastern battlement one last time before he sleeps. The sea below is black and infinite, and the stars above are white and infinite, and between these two infinities he stands, a finite being, a man with a sword and a stone and a heart full of things he cannot say, and he looks out at the darkness and he speaks. Not aloud. He speaks in the silence of his thoughts, in the language that requires no air and no sound and no listener except the one who hears everything. He says, I was carried to the top of the cliff and through the gate and into the chamber and through the battle and to this moment. I was carried by the faith that was placed in me and by the stone that was given to me and by the hand that raised me and by the purpose that filled me. I did not climb alone. No one climbs alone. We are carried by everyone who believes in us, and we carry in turn everyone who depends on us, and the carrying never ends. It goes on and on, from one cliff to the next, from one gate to the next, from one battle to the next, from one dawn to the next, until the final dawn, the one that we will not see from this side of the world, but that we trust with every fiber of what we are, will be the most beautiful of all. He turns from the battlement and walks into the fortress, and the stone against his chest glows with a warmth that no one else can feel, and the night closes around him like a hand closing around something precious, holding it gently, holding it firmly, holding it with the knowledge that what it holds is irreplaceable and that the darkness, for all its vastness, is not large enough to take it away. The fortress sleeps, the sea speaks, the stars watch. And far away, in a palace in a city that is not her home, a woman stands at a window with her hand on her chest, and she feels, across the miles and the mountains and the darkness, a warmth that she cannot explain but that she recognizes, because it is the same warmth she felt when she placed a stone in a man's hand and told him he was her salvation. The stone glows, the distance holds, the hearts beat in rhythm across the impossible gap between them. And the war moves on, carrying everyone with it, toward a dawn that no one has seen but that everyone believes in, because belief is the only thing stronger than the darkness, and the darkness, for all its power, has never once succeeded in putting out a light that was carried by someone who refused to let it go. The story does not end here. It cannot end here. There are too many threads still unwoven, too many debts still unpaid, too many promises still unfulfilled. The emperor has not yet responded. The traitor has not yet been judged. The villages have not yet been rebuilt. The lovers have not yet been reunited. The brothers have not yet fully reckoned with the consequences of their division. The fortress has not yet been tested by the force that will surely come to reclaim it. All of this lies ahead. All of it waits in the future like an army massed beyond the horizon, invisible but undeniable, patient but inevitable. And the only certainty, the only thing that can be said with absolute confidence about what comes next, is that whatever comes next will demand everything from everyone, and that those who answer that demand with courage and faith and the willingness to carry each other through the darkness will emerge into a light that was worth every step of the journey. The fortress stands, the flags fly, the sea speaks. And the war is not over. The fortress of Demadrias rises from the ridge like a fist clenched against the sky, its walls thick enough to swallow the dreams of every army that has ever stood before them and stared upward at the battlements where defenders move like insects along the lip of a wound that refuses to heal. The stones are old, older than the men who guard them, older than the empire that claims them, older than the memory of whoever first stacked one block upon another, and called it civilization, called it safety, called it the boundary between order and the chaos that howls beyond the gates like a wolf that has been denied its kill for so long that hunger has become its entire identity. The walls are scarred. Siege engines have gnawed at them across the centuries. Catapult stones have left craters in their faces like the pockmarks of a disease that the fortress survived, but never fully recovered from. And yet they stand. They have always stood. They have stood against Persians and Arabs and crusaders and pretenders and madmen and every other species of ambition that the human race has manufactured in its endless, bloody quest to own what cannot be owned and hold what cannot be held. But tonight those walls face something they have never faced before. Tonight those walls face the Sultan. He sits on his horse at the edge of the plain, close enough to see the torchlight moving along the battlements, close enough to hear the distant bark of officers issuing commands to garrison troops who are even now reinforcing the gate with timber and iron, and the particular desperation that comes from knowing that the force assembled on the plain below is not an army that has come to negotiate. It is an army that has come to end something. And in the failing light of the day's last hour, as the sun bleeds its final red across a horizon that seems to stretch to the edge of the world, the Sultan studies the fortress with the patient intensity of a man reading scripture, searching for the verse that will unlock meaning, searching for the weakness that Evronos promised to find, the crack in the stone through which the flood of justice might be poured. Evronos stands beside the Sultan's horse, and he has not slept. His eyes are red-rimmed and hollow, the eyes of a man who has spent the hours since his liberation not in rest but in relentless reconnaissance, crawling on his belly through scrub and stone to examine the fortress from every possible angle, sending scouts along the cliff face to measure the height of the walls at their lowest point, studying the flow of water into and out of the garrison, to identify the aqueduct that every fortress of this age relies upon like a stone artery feeding a stone heart. And now, standing before the Sultan with a map scratched in the dirt at their feet using the point of a dagger, he delivers the intelligence that may determine whether the walls of Demadrias continue to stand or finally, after all these centuries, learn what it means to fall. He says the fortress is strongest at the front. The gate is reinforced with triple-layered oak bound in iron. The towers flanking the gate provide overlapping fields of fire for archers, and the approach is uphill across open ground with no cover. A frontal assault would cost us half our army before we reached the walls. We would spend lives like water poured onto sand, and the sand would remain dry. The Sultan listens. His face betrays nothing. Evronos continues. He says the eastern wall is built along the cliff edge. It is thinner than the other walls because the cliff itself was considered a sufficient defense. In most circumstances, that assessment would be correct. The cliff is sheer. It drops 200 feet to the rocks below. No army could climb it in force. But here, at this point, and he marks a spot on his dirt map with the dagger's tip, there is a fault line in the cliff face. A narrow ledge that runs diagonally from the base to a point approximately 30 feet below the eastern wall. A man, a careful man, a man unencumbered by heavy armor and possessed of considerable courage and even more considerable balance, could traverse that ledge. A small team, perhaps 20 men, could reach the base of the eastern wall where it is thinnest and most neglected. And from there, with ropes and grappling hooks and the blessing of the Almighty, they could be over the wall before the garrison knows they are there. The Sultan says, and then what? 20 men inside a fortress garrisoned by hundreds. And Evronos says 20 men is all we need, because the eastern wall is where the gate mechanism is housed. The chain that holds the portcullis, the winch that operates the drawbridge, all of it is accessed from a chamber built into the eastern wall. If 20 men can reach that chamber and hold it long enough to raise the portcullis and lower the drawbridge, the entire army can pour through the front gate, while the garrison is still trying to understand what has happened. The fortress falls not from the front, where they expect us, but from the side, where they believe the cliff protects them. Their greatest confidence becomes their greatest vulnerability. The Sultan looks at Evronos, and in his eyes is the particular assessment of a commander evaluating not merely a plan but the man who proposed it. He says, who leads the 20. And before Evronos can answer, a voice speaks from behind them, and it is Abdul Rahman's voice, and it carries the quiet certainty of a man who has already decided, and who offers his decision not as a suggestion but as a fact that the universe has already accepted. He says, I will lead them. The Sultan turns. Abdul Rahman stands in the gathering darkness, and the stone that Alina gave him rests against his chest beneath his armor, and its warmth is a constant companion, a reminder of what waits for him if he survives and what will mourn him if he does not. The Sultan studies his face and sees there what he expected to see: the absence of hesitation, the presence of purpose, the look of a man who has weighed his life against his duty and found his life to be the lighter of the two. The Sultan says, this is a task from which return is not guaranteed, Abdul Rahman. The ledge is narrow, the wall is high. And if the garrison discovers you before you reach the chamber, there will be no rescue, no retreat, only the choice between fighting to the last breath and falling from the cliff into the sea. Abdurrahman says, every breath I have drawn since the day I swore my oath has been borrowed from the Almighty, my Sultan. If he chooses to reclaim what is his on that cliff face, then I go to him with a clear conscience and a full heart. But I do not believe I will fall. I believe I will climb. I believe I will reach the chamber. I believe I will open the gate. And I believe that when the sun rises tomorrow, it will rise on a fortress that belongs to us. The Sultan holds his gaze for a long moment, then he nods, and the nod is not merely permission, it is acknowledgement. It is the recognition of one extraordinary soul by another, the silent communion of men who understand that some missions transcend strategy and enter the realm of destiny. Night falls. It falls completely, absolutely, as though someone has drawn a curtain across the sky, and the stars that emerge do so grudgingly, as though even they are reluctant to witness what is about to unfold. The fortress lights its torches, and from the plain below, the walls glow with an orange luminescence that makes them look less like stone and more like the gates of some infernal realm, a threshold between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. Abdul Rahman selects his 20 men. He does not choose the strongest or the tallest or the most experienced. He chooses the quietest, the men who move like shadows, the men who can control their breathing so completely that they could stand beside a sleeping guard and not wake him, the men whose hands are steady enough to grip wet stone in the dark without trembling. The men who pray not with their lips but with their actions, who treat every movement as an act of worship and every silence as a conversation with the divine. They strip their armor, they wrap their swords in cloth to prevent them from clanging against their bodies. They blacken their faces and hands with charcoal from the cooking fires. They carry ropes coiled across their backs and grappling hooks padded with leather to muffle the sound of impact. And they carry, each of them, the knowledge that what they are about to attempt has never been done before, that no force in the recorded history of this fortress has ever attempted to breach it from the cliffside, that they are walking into the realm of the untried and the unprecedented, where the only map is faith and the only compass is the conviction that the Almighty does not waste the courage of those who serve him. Abdul Rahman leads them from the camp under cover of darkness, skirting the edge of the plain, moving through terrain that would be invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. They reach the base of the cliff as the moon rises, a thin crescent that provides just enough light to see by but not enough to be seen by. The cliff face looms above them, a vertical wall of dark stone that seems to lean forward as though contemplating whether to crush them before they begin. Abdul Rahman finds the ledge that Evronos described. It is narrower than he expected. In some places it is no wider than the span of his hand, a ribbon of stone pressed against the cliff face like a scar from a wound that healed improperly. In other places it widens to perhaps 2 feet, enough to stand on if you press your back against the cliff and do not look down, if you do not think about the 200 feet of empty air between your heels and the rocks below where the sea breaks itself into foam with the endless, indifferent violence of water that does not care whether you live or die. He begins to climb. His men follow in single file, each one placing his feet in the footprints of the man ahead, each one gripping the same handholds, each one breathing in the same controlled rhythm that Abdul Rahman sets, a rhythm designed to keep the heart rate low and the mind focused and the body as light as possible on stone that could crumble beneath their weight at any moment without warning. The ascent takes 2 hours, 2 hours of silence so complete that the only sound is the whisper of cloth against stone and the distant crash of waves far below and the occasional skitter of loose pebbles that each man freezes at, holding his breath, waiting to hear the shout from above. That would mean discovery, that would mean arrows and boiling oil and the long spinning fall into darkness. But the shout does not come. The garrison above is focused on the plain, where the Sultan has ordered his campfires to be built larger and more numerous than usual, creating the impression of an army preparing for a dawn assault on the front gate. The garrison watches those fires with the particular intensity of defenders who believe they know where the threat is coming from, and they never once look over the cliff edge at their unprotected flank because why would they? No one has ever come from that direction. No one would be insane enough to try. No one except Abdul Rahman. He reaches the base of the eastern wall at the darkest hour of the night, the hour when human vitality is at its lowest ebb, when guards are most likely to doze and sentries are most likely to let their eyes drift from their assigned sectors toward the more interesting spectacle of the camp fires on the plain. He presses himself against the wall and feels the stone beneath his fingers, cool and rough, ancient and indifferent, and he whispers a prayer that is not for safety or success, but for worthiness, the prayer of a man who wants only to deserve the opportunity that the Almighty has placed before him. Then he swings the grappling hook. The padded leather muffles the impact, but the sound is still audible, a soft thud against the battlement that makes Abdul Rahman's heart stop for one terrible instant before it resumes its rhythm. He waits. No alarm, no shout, no arrow whistling out of the darkness. He pulls on the rope, feels the hook catch on stone, tests the weight, and begins to climb. The wall is 30 feet high at this point, and he covers the distance in the time it takes a man to recite the first verse of a prayer he has known since childhood. His arms burn, his fingers ache. The rope bites into his palms through the leather wraps he wound around them. But he climbs, and when he reaches the top of the battlement and pulls himself over the lip of the wall, he finds himself in an empty corridor lit by a single torch guttering in its bracket at the far end. He signals to the men below. One by one they ascend, ghosts rising from the abyss, materializing on the wall like spirits summoned by incantation. When all 20 are assembled, they move along the corridor in absolute silence, their cloth-wrapped swords in their hands, their charcoal-blackened faces turning them into something that barely registers as human in the dim torchlight, something that belongs more to the realm of nightmare than to the world of flesh and blood and iron. They find the gate chamber where Evronos said it would be. The door is unlocked because why would it be locked? It is on the cliff side, the safe side, the impregnable side. Inside, the mechanism that operates the portcullis gleams in the torchlight, a massive assembly of chains and gears, and counterweights that represents the engineering genius of a civilization that built its empire on the principle that walls keep you safe and gates keep you in control. 2 guards sit inside the chamber, playing a game of dice on a wooden crate. They look up when the door opens, and their expressions pass through several states in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally the particular terror of men who understand that they are about to die, and that there is absolutely nothing they can do to prevent it. Abdul Rahman crosses the distance between the door and the guards in 3 strides. His sword, unwrapped now, freed from its cloth bindings, whispers through the air with the sound of silk being torn, and the first guard falls without making a sound louder than the clatter of his dice hitting the floor. The second guard opens his mouth to scream, and the scream is born and dies in the same instant, severed by a blade that crosses his throat with the precision of a calligrapher's pen crossing a letter. Abdul Rahman turns to his men and says one word: now. They move to the mechanism. 4 men seize the winch handle and begin to turn it. The chains groan, the gears engage. Somewhere in the depths of the fortress wall, counterweights shift and the portcullis, that massive grid of iron that has sealed the front gate against every army that has ever approached it, begins to rise. Simultaneously, two men release the brake on the drawbridge mechanism, and the bridge, a platform of oak and iron that weighs as much as 10 horses, begins to lower with a sound like thunder rolling across a valley. The garrison hears it. Of course they hear it. The sound of the portcullis rising and the drawbridge lowering is unmistakable, a sound that every man in the fortress has been trained to recognize because it means that the gate is opening and the gate should not be opening, and if the gate is opening when it should not be opening, then something has gone catastrophically wrong. Shouts erupt from the battlements. Officers scream orders. Soldiers abandon their positions on the front wall and rush toward the gate, their weapons drawn, their boots pounding on the stone corridors in a cacophony of panic that fills the fortress like water filling a sinking ship. But they are too late. They are too late because by the time they reach the gate, the portcullis is fully raised and the drawbridge is fully lowered, and the mouth of the fortress yawns open like a wound that cannot be closed. And through that wound pours the Sultan's army. The Sultan himself leads the charge. His horse surges through the gate at a full gallop, its hooves striking sparks from the stone of the drawbridge, and behind him rides the vanguard, Tarhin at the head of the first cavalry squadron, his sword already wet before he crosses the threshold because a defender who tried to stop him at the gate learned the lesson that all of Tarhin's opponents eventually learn. That trying to stop Tarhin is like trying to stop the tide by standing in the surf and commanding the ocean to retreat. The courtyard erupts into chaos. The garrison, caught between the horror of a breached gate and the impossibility of a cliffside infiltration, fragments into pockets of resistance that are fierce but uncoordinated, islands of defiance in a rising sea of steel. The Sultan's cavalry crashes through the courtyard like a flood breaking through a dam, the horses' iron-shod hooves grinding against the flagstones as their riders swing their swords in arcs that catch the torchlight and fling it back in scattered fragments of orange and gold. The defenders form lines that buckle and break and form again further back, each contraction bringing them closer to the inner keep where Shahanshah waits with Indrias and whatever remains of his inner guard. Tarhin is everywhere. He materializes wherever the fighting is thickest, wherever the defenders have managed to establish a foothold that threatens to slow the advance, and he dismantles those footholds with the methodical efficiency of a man pulling apart a structure that he himself could have built, understanding intuitively where the load-bearing elements are and striking at precisely those points. His sword intercepts a spear thrust aimed at the Sultan's horse. His blade catches a Byzantine officer across the face as the man draws back his arm to hurl a javelin. His shield blocks an arrow that comes from a window above the courtyard, the impact driving him back a step but no further, and he looks up at the window and marks the archer's position with the calm precision of a man making a note to deal with a minor inconvenience when time permits. Behind the cavalry, the infantry surges through the gate in dense columns, their shields overlapping, their spears leveled, their war cry rising above the sound of steel and screaming with a depth and resonance that makes the very walls vibrate. Orhan Faladios leads a contingent toward the western tower, where a group of defenders has retreated and barricaded the stairwell. He hits the barricade with the force of his body and his conviction simultaneously, and the timbers crack and splinter, and he pours through the gap with his men behind him. And the stairwell becomes a vertical slaughterhouse where the advantage belongs to the man ascending rather than the man descending, because the man ascending has momentum and fury and the unshakable belief that the top of the stairs is his by divine right. In the eastern wall, Abdul Rahman and his 20 hold the gate chamber against a counterattack that arrives in the form of 30 garrison soldiers led by a Byzantine lieutenant who understands that if the gate mechanism can be reversed, if the portcullis can be dropped and the drawbridge raised, the invading force will be trapped inside the fortress with its supply lines cut and its reinforcements blocked. The lieutenant is right. If he succeeds, the battle reverses. The fortress becomes a trap not for its defenders but for its attackers, and the Sultan's army, cut off from the plain, will be destroyed piecemeal in the corridors and courtyards of a structure designed specifically for that purpose. Abdul Rahman knows this. He knows it with the clarity that comes from understanding the difference between a position that must be held and a position that should be held. This position must be held, not should, must. And so he plants himself in the doorway of the gate chamber like a tree whose roots reach down to the molten core of the earth, and he fights. The doorway is narrow, only 2 men can approach him at a time, and Abdul Rahman uses this bottleneck with the expertise of a man who has studied the art of confined combat until it became second nature, as instinctive as breathing, as automatic as the beating of his heart. His sword moves in short, precise arcs designed to maximize damage within a limited range of motion. He does not swing wildly, he does not overextend. He keeps his blade close to his body, using the walls on either side as extensions of his guard, channeling the attackers into a killing zone so narrow that their numerical superiority becomes not an advantage but a liability, each man tripping over the body of the man who fell before him. The Byzantine lieutenant watches his soldiers fall one after another into the meat grinder of Abdul Rahman's defense, and he recognizes, with the bitter clarity that comes too late, that the man in the doorway is not merely a skilled fighter. He is something more, something that transcends skill and enters the realm of purpose. The lieutenant has faced skilled fighters before and defeated them. But he has never faced a man who fights as though every stroke is a prayer, every parry an act of worship, every kill a verse in a sacred text being written in real time on the floor of the gate chamber. The lieutenant calls his men back. He reassesses. He looks for another way into the chamber, but there is none. The chamber was built with a single entrance because the architects who designed it never imagined that enemies would enter through the cliffside. The single entrance was considered sufficient, an architectural convenience, a feature of a design predicated on the assumption that the threat would always come from the front. And now that assumption has been shattered, and the lieutenant and his soldiers stand in the corridor looking at a doorway choked with their own dead, and a man who shows no sign of tiring and no inclination to move. While this struggle plays out in the depths of the wall, the main battle in the courtyard reaches its crescendo. The Sultan has driven the garrison back to the inner keep, and the doors of the keep are being barricaded from within, timbers and furniture and anything heavy enough to resist the force of a battering ram being piled against the entrance by Shahanshah's personal guard, with the frantic energy of men who know that what they're doing is temporary, that no barricade holds forever, that every door eventually opens to the one who knocks with sufficient force and sufficient patience. Inside the keep, Shahanshah stands in the center of the great hall, and around him the world is contracting. The fortress that was supposed to be his impregnable stronghold has been breached. The walls that were supposed to hold forever have been climbed. The gate that was supposed to remain closed has been opened by 20 men who walked along a cliff ledge in the dark and changed the course of a siege in the time it takes to turn a winch. Everything he planned, everything he calculated. Everything he believed about the relationship between stone and steel and power and safety. All of it undone by a man with a rope and a grappling hook and the kind of faith that moves mountains because it does not recognize that mountains are supposed to be immovable. Indrias stands beside him, and his face carries the expression of a chess player who has just realized, 12 moves too late, that his opponent has been playing a different game entirely. He says, "We can hold the keep for a time. The walls are thick. The garrison in the inner ward is still organized. If we can get a message to the harbor, the ships can evacuate us before they breach the inner doors." But Shahanshah is not listening. He is looking at the great hall around him, at the Byzantine mosaics on the walls, at the throne that does not belong to him, at the symbols of an empire whose protection he sought and whose weakness he is now experiencing firsthand. And he says something that surprises Indrias, something that does not come from the strategist or the schemer or the politician, but from some deeper, older part of Shahanshah's soul, a part that has been buried so long beneath layers of ambition and calculation that even Shahanshah himself has forgotten it existed. He says, "This is what we have become." Indrias says, "Shahanshah, we must move. There is no time for reflection." But Shahanshah continues, his voice carrying the hollow resonance of a man speaking from inside a cavern that has just collapsed around him. He says, "We burned their villages, Indrias. We sent soldiers to terrorize women and children and old men who have never held a sword in their lives. We used innocents as shields, and for what? For time. For a few more hours inside walls that fell anyway. For the privilege of standing in a room that belongs to someone else, wearing a crown that was never ours, pretending that power can be held by those who are willing to commit any atrocity in its name." Indrias grabs Shahanshah by the arm, and the physical contact shocks the ruler out of his reverie. Indrias says, "Whatever we have become, we can become something else. But only if we survive. Dead men do not change, Shahanshah. Dead men do not learn. Dead men do not get the chance to make different choices. If you want to be something other than what you are, you must first continue to be. Now move, the harbor, the ships, now." And the practicality of this argument, its brutal, unadorned logic, penetrates where philosophy could not. Shahanshah nods. He gathers his inner guard. And they move through the corridors of the keep toward the passage that leads to the harbor. A passage known only to the fortress commander and his most trusted officers. A passage that winds through the living rock beneath the foundations and emerges on a ledge above the water where boats can be lowered and ships can approach and men can escape the consequences of their own decisions. But escape is not the simple matter that Indrias imagines, because the Sultan has anticipated this possibility. Evronos told him about the passage. Evronos, who spent hours studying the fortress's architecture, who questioned scouts and examined old drawings and pieced together the fortress's secrets with the patient diligence of a man dismantling a puzzle whose pieces spanned centuries of construction and modification. Evronos identified the harbor passage as the most likely escape route and recommended that it be sealed. And the Sultan, who trusts Evronos as a surgeon, trusts his scalpel, sent Tamir Boga and 50 soldiers through the cliffs below the harbor to block the passage exit before the assault on the gate even began. Shahanshah and his guard descend through the passage in darkness, their torches flickering against walls that weep with moisture, their footsteps echoing in the confined space with a regularity that mimics the beating of a failing heart. They move quickly, driven by the sounds of battle that filter down through the stone above them, muffled and distorted but unmistakably growing closer, the Sultan's forces penetrating deeper into the fortress with every minute that passes. They reach the exit. The passage opens onto the ledge above the harbor, and Shahanshah steps through the doorway into the night air and the salt spray and the hope of salvation, and what he sees makes him stop as suddenly as though he has walked into a wall. Tamir Boga stands on the ledge with 50 soldiers, their weapons drawn, their faces painted with the calm certainty of men who have been given a specific task and who intend to execute it with the thoroughness that their sultan demands. Behind them, the harbor stretches out under the stars, and the Byzantine ships that were supposed to provide evacuation sit at anchor, but between the ships and the ledge, a line of small boats filled with Ottoman soldiers blocks the approach, their archers standing ready, their bowstrings drawn, their arrows aimed at the passage exit with the precision of men who have been waiting for exactly this moment. Shahanshah looks at Tamir Boga looks at Shahanshah, and between them passes the particular communication that requires no words, the communication between a man who has run out of options and a man who represents the last option's closing. Tamir Boga says there is nowhere left to go, Shahanshah. The fortress is taken, the harbor is blocked, the Emperor's ships will not save you, nothing will save you, your time has ended. Shahanshah draws his sword. It is a reflexive motion, the instinct of a man who has spent his life solving problems with steel and who has never learned any other method. But the sword feels different in his hand now. It feels heavier than it should. It feels like an object that belongs to a different man, a man who existed an hour ago or a day ago or a lifetime ago, but who no longer exists in this moment on this ledge above this harbor. Andreas places his hand on Shahanshah's sword arm and pushes it down. He says, "No, not like this, not here. If we die fighting on this ledge, we die as footnote. Our deaths accomplish nothing. Our blood feeds nothing. It simply spills into the sea and is forgotten by morning. But if we surrender, if we stand before the Sultan and face his judgment, at least we face it on our feet. At least we face it with whatever remains of our dignity. And at least the killing stops." Shahanshah looks at Andreas, and in his eyes is the particular desolation of a man who has just heard the truth spoken by someone he did not expect to speak it. The killing stops. Two words that carry more weight than all the strategic calculations and political maneuverings and military operations that have brought them to this point. The killing stops. The villages stop burning. The soldiers stop dying. The women stop screaming. The children stop hiding. The world, for one brief moment, stops bleeding. Shahanshah opens his fingers. The sword falls from his hand and clatters on the stone ledge, and the sound it makes is not the sound of defeat. It is the sound of something else entirely, something that has no name in the vocabulary of war, something that exists in the silence between the last shot fired and the first word of surrender, something fragile and improbable and absolutely necessary. And Tamir Boga steps forward and says, "You will come with us, now." They lead Shahanshah and Andreas back through the passage, back up through the rock, back into the fortress that has fallen around them like a house built on sand. The corridors that were filled with the sounds of fighting are quieter now, the resistance collapsing as word spreads through the garrison that the commander has been taken and the harbor is blocked and the inner keep has been breached. Soldiers drop their weapons. Officers order their men to stand down. The machine of defense, deprived of its animating purpose, grinds to a halt with the finality of a clock whose mainspring has broken. In the courtyard, the Sultan sits on his horse amid the wreckage of the battle. Bodies litter the flagstones. Torches burn in brackets that were designed to illuminate celebrations, not carnage. The smoke from the fighting hangs in the air like a veil drawn across the face of something too terrible to look at directly. And when Shahanshah is brought before him, when the man who ordered villages burned and innocents terrorized is forced to his knees on the stones of his own courtyard, the Sultan looks down at him from the height of his saddle, and his face is unreadable. Not triumphant, not vengeful, not merciful, unreadable, as though the emotions that move behind that face are too complex and too contradictory to be expressed in any single expression that the human face is capable of producing. The Sultan says, "You burn my villages." Shahanshah says nothing. The Sultan says, "You terrorized my people, women, children, the old and the helpless and the innocent. You sent soldiers to destroy what they could not defend against, and you called it strategy." Shahanshah says nothing. The Sultan says, "Raise your head, look at me." Shahanshah raises his head, and what passes between them in that look is something that will never be recorded in any chronicle, never be captured in any poem, never be accurately described by any narrator no matter how skilled. because it belongs to the realm of things that can only be experienced, never communicated. It is the look between two men who have each seen the worst that the other is capable of, and who must now decide in this moment on these blood-stained stones what comes next. The Sultan says justice will be served, but not tonight. Tonight the killing stops. He turns to his commanders and says, secure the fortress, tend the wounded, bury the dead, all the dead, theirs as well as ours. They fought bravely. Their courage deserves acknowledgement even if their cause does not. He dismounts and walks through the courtyard, and as he walks, men step aside to let him pass, clearing a path not because they have been ordered to, but because the particular quality of his presence at this moment demands a space around it that no one wishes to violate. He walks to the eastern wall where Abdul Rahman still stands in the doorway of the gate chamber, surrounded by the bodies of the men who tried and failed to retake it. Abdul Rahman sees the Sultan approaching and straightens, and his exhaustion is visible in every line of his body, in the way his sword arm hangs at his side, in the way his shoulders slope forward, in the way his breathing comes in shallow, ragged drafts that suggest his lungs have been working at maximum capacity for longer than any physician would consider advisable. But when the Sultan reaches him, Abdul Rahman bows, and the bow is not merely the bow of a soldier acknowledging his commander. It is the bow of a man acknowledging the purpose that gave his actions meaning. The Sultan places his hand on Abdul Rahman's shoulder and says, the gate held because you held it. The fortress fell because you climbed. Every man who survives this night owes his life to you. And hear his voice carries a weight that Abdul Rahman has never heard before. I owe you a debt that cannot be repaid with titles or treasure or any material thing. The debt I owe you is the debt of a brother, and it will be honored as such for as long as I draw breath. Abdul Rahman reaches beneath his armor and produces the stone that Alina gave him. He holds it up, and in the torchlight it catches the flame and transforms it, refracting the light into colors that have no name, scattering it across the blood-stained walls of the gate chamber in patterns that seem almost, but not quite, like writing. He says, I did not climb alone, my Sultan, I was carried. And the Sultan looks at the stone, and he understands, and he nods, and no more needs to be said. The night deepens toward dawn, the fortress is secured, the prisoners are counted. The wounded are carried to the great hall where physicians work by torchlight, their hands moving with practiced urgency from body to body, stitching and binding and cauterizing with the particular detachment that medical necessity requires, treating friend and enemy alike because the oath they swore makes no distinction between the two. Fatima walks through the courtyard with Halima beside her, and they do not speak because the scene around them says everything that words could not improve upon. The cost of the night is written on the flagstones in a language that requires no translation. The price of freedom, the price of justice, the price of every noble principle that men fight and die for, is written there in red, and it is a price that must be acknowledged before it can be accepted, and accepted before it can be paid, and paid before it can be transcended. Evronos stands on the battlement of the eastern wall, looking out over the cliff edge at the sea where the moonlight makes a road of silver across the water. He thinks of his daughter. He thinks of the promise he made to her before he left, the promise that he would return. He is not a man given to sentiment, but in this moment, with the salt wind on his face and the sounds of aftermath rising from the courtyard behind him, he allows himself a single moment of something that might be called vulnerability, a moment in which the commander puts down his title and his strategy and his tactical genius and becomes simply a father who misses his child. Then the moment passes, his face resets, the commander returns, and he turns from the battlement and walks back into the fortress to begin the work of assessing what has been won and what it will cost to hold it. Meanwhile, in the dungeon beneath the inner keep, Yakut sits in a cell that was, until a few hours ago, reserved for the fortress's own prisoners. The irony of this is not lost on him, but irony provides neither comfort nor escape, and Yakut has neither. He sits on the stone floor with his back against the wall, and his eyes stare at the opposite wall with the particular blankness of a man whose mind is processing the complete and irrevocable collapse of everything he believed he controlled. His schemes, his manipulations, his carefully constructed network of betrayals and counter-betrayals, each one designed to advance his position at the expense of everyone around him, all of it gone, dissolved in the acid of a single night's catastrophe. Difne sits in the adjacent cell. She does not share Yakut's blankness. Her eyes are active, scanning the cell for weakness, evaluating the guard rotation, calculating the odds of escape with the relentless pragmatism that has kept her alive through situations that would have destroyed anyone less adaptable. She's already planning, she's already scheming, she's already constructing the framework of a next move in a game that, for her, never truly ends. But for now the bars hold, the guards watch, and the dawn approaches. Somewhere between Bursa and the fortress of Demadrias, between the city where Nilufar sits with letters pressed to her heart and the battlefield where her husband has just changed the shape of the world, a messenger rides. He rides with dispatches that carry the news of the fortress's fall, and in those dispatches are the names of the living and the dead, the terms of Shahanshah's surrender, the inventory of captured weapons and provisions, and a single line written in the Sultan's own hand, addressed to no one by name but understood by everyone who will read it. The line says, "By the grace of the Almighty, Demadrias is ours. The villages will be rebuilt, the people will return, and those who ordered their destruction will answer for it when the time comes." The messenger rides through the night, and behind him, receding into the distance but never truly disappearing, the fortress sits upon its ridge with new flags flying from its towers, flags that catch the first light of a dawn that has finally, reluctantly, consented to arrive. The flags snap in the wind. The torches are extinguished one by one as the natural light returns. And the world, battered and bleeding and broken in 100 places, begins the slow, painful, absolutely necessary process of healing. But healing is not the same as ending. The fortress has fallen, Shahanshah is captured, the villages are saved, the prisoners are freed, the gate is open and the walls are breached, and the empire that sent its ships to protect its interests watches from the harbor as its investment burns. But the emperor still sits in Constantinople. His armies are still vast. His patience is still long. His ambition is still the ambition of an institution that has survived for 1,000 years by learning to lose battles without losing wars, to surrender positions without surrendering purpose, to retreat from the field today in order to return to the field tomorrow with greater force and deeper resolve. The Sultan knows this, Evronos knows this, every commander in the army that now occupies the fortress of Demadrias knows this. The victory they have won tonight is real, but it is not final. It is a chapter, not an ending. It is a verse, not a poem. It is a single note in a symphony that will continue to play long after the instruments that sounded have been broken and repaired and broken again. And somewhere in the fortress, in a room where the dawn light enters through a window that faces east, toward Mecca, toward the holy city that lies beyond the horizon like a promise that the world has not yet kept, Abdul Rahman kneels in prayer. The stone from Alina rests on the floor before him, and its surface catches the new light and transforms it, scattering colors across the prayer rug like flowers strewn on the path of a bridegroom. And Abdul Rahman bows his head and speaks words that belong not to the language of war, but to the language of gratitude, the language of awe, the language of a man who has climbed a cliff in the dark and opened a gate that was supposed to remain closed forever, and who knows, with every fiber of his being, that he did not do this alone. He did not climb alone. He was carried. The dawn brightens, the fortress stands under new ownership, the flags fly, the wounded moan and the dead are silent, and the living breathe and the world turns. And the war is not over. The war is never over. It simply moves, it shifts, it transforms. It puts on new faces and new names and marches under new banners, toward new fortresses and new cliffs and new gates that must be opened by men and women whose names we do not yet know, but whose courage we can already feel, building like thunder on the far side of the mountains, building like the tide in the hours before it turns, building like the faith of those who have been told that the impossible is merely the untried and who have chosen. Against all evidence and all probability and all the weight of a world that insists on the permanence of its walls, to try anyway. The story continues, the blood dries, the stone glows. And somewhere, far from the fortress and the battlefield and the harbor and the palace and the forest where two brothers settled their account in moonlight, somewhere in the vast and unfathomable architecture of destiny, a page turns. And the next chapter begins. The dawn does not arrive gently on a morning such as this. It claws its way above the eastern ridgeline like a wounded animal dragging itself from a ditch, painting the sky in shades of rust and bruised purple, and the light it casts across the landscape is not the light of hope but the light of exposure, the light that reveals what darkness had mercifully concealed, the bodies in the forest clearing, the blood on the stream bank, the tracks of fleeing men pressed deep into mud that has already begun to harden around the evidence of their terror. Darsan stands over his brother. Daimir Khan lies on the ground beside the stream, his sword arm bent at an angle that nature never intended, his breathing shallow and ragged, each inhale accompanied by a wet sound that speaks of damage deep within the chest cavity where steel has explored territories that belong only to the organs and the Almighty. He is alive. Darsan made certain of that. Every stroke of his blade during their final confrontation was measured with surgical precision, designed not to kill but to dismantle, to strip away the capacity for violence without extinguishing the flame of consciousness, because Darsan meant what he said when he told Mustafa that he wanted his brother breathing when the end came. This debt required a living debtor. Darsan crouches beside Daimir Khan, and the stream sings its indifferent song between them, the water carrying thin ribbons of crimson downstream toward destinations that neither brother will ever see. Darsan's voice, when he speaks, carries the particular exhaustion of a man who has just destroyed something he spent his entire life simultaneously hating and loving. He says, "I did not want this, you know that. In whatever part of your mind still functions behind those eyes, you know that I begged you to choose differently. I begged you to see reason, but you were always too proud. Pride was the wall you built around yourself, and now that wall has collapsed and there is nothing inside it, nothing but this, a broken man beside a stream in a forest that does not know his name." Damir Khan tries to speak. His lips move. Blood appears at the corner of his mouth, dark and sluggish, and the words that emerge are barely audible above the sound of the water. He says, "Finish it." And Darsan shakes his head slowly, and the motion carries a weight of sorrow so immense that the very air around him seems to thicken with it. He says, "No, you will live. You will live with the knowledge of what you became. You will live with the memory of every soldier who died following your orders tonight. You will live with the faces of the men whose blood stains this ground because you were too stubborn and too vain to accept that leadership is not a birthright but a sacred responsibility. Death would be mercy, brother, and you have spent your entire life ensuring that you deserve no mercy from me." Mustafa emerges from the tree line with soldiers behind him, and when he sees Damir Khan on the ground, his face registers neither surprise nor satisfaction but the grim acknowledgement of a man who has seen enough violence to understand that victory and tragedy are often the same thing wearing different faces. He says, "Darsan Saheb, we found the false trail. When we realized the deception, we doubled back. Your instincts were correct." Darsan rises from his crouch and looks at Mustafa with eyes that have aged a decade in the span of a single night. He says, "Bind his wounds. Keep him alive. He will answer for what he has done, but he will answer to justice, not to vengeance. There is a difference, and if we fail to honor that difference, we are no better than him." Mustafa nods and directs the soldiers to tend to Damir Khan, and as they work, wrapping torn cloth around wounds that seep and suppurate, Darsan walks to the edge of the clearing and looks up at the sky where the dawn continues its reluctant ascent. He stands there for a long time, his silhouette dark against the bleeding horizon, and the forest around him is silent except for the stream and the wind and the distant, almost imagined sound of a world rearranging itself around the consequences of what has just occurred. Far from that clearing, across leagues of terrain that shift from forest to plain, to the broken, rocky foothills of mountains whose peaks scrape the belly of heaven, the convoy carrying Fatima and Evronos presses onward through the early morning light. The new guard detachment that Indriya is assigned is larger and more disciplined than the original escort, and they move with the professional efficiency of soldiers who understand that the cargo they protect is more valuable than their own lives. The commander of this detachment is a Byzantine captain whose name will not be remembered by history, but whose competence in this moment makes him one of the most dangerous men on the road. He has positioned outriders on both flanks, scouts ahead and behind, and the main body of the escort forms a tight box around the prisoner cart, their shields overlapping, their spears angled outward like the quills of a porcupine that has learned to walk. Inside the cart, Fatima watches the landscape change through the gaps between the wooden slats. She sees the terrain narrowing, the road beginning to climb, the ridgelines on either side growing closer and steeper as though the earth itself is closing its jaws around the convoy. She has traveled these roads before in better times, when she rode free and proud alongside her brother and her father, when the wind carried the scent of possibility rather than the stench of captivity. She knows this geography. She knows what lies ahead. She leans toward Evronos and speaks in a whisper so low that even the guard standing 3 feet from the cart cannot hear it above the creak of the wheels and the clop of hooves. She says, "The valley of Sarihan is ahead. The road narrows there. If anyone is coming for us, that is where they will come." Evronos does not look at her. He has learned through bitter experience that prisoners who are seen whispering attract attention, and attention attracts punishment. He keeps his eyes fixed on the floor of the cart and moves his lips barely enough to form words. He says, "Your brother knows this terrain as well as you do. If he has sent someone, they will be waiting in the narrows. But the guard is strong, Fatima, stronger than what they had before. Whoever comes will need to be more than brave. They will need to be extraordinary." And the word hangs between them like a prayer, because both of them know that extraordinary is precisely what the people they serve have always been. Not because they possess abilities that others lack, but because they possess a willingness to attempt things that others would not dare. A willingness to ride into the teeth of impossibility and emerge on the other side carrying the impossible in their arms like a rescued child. The cart rolls on, the valley approaches, and somewhere on the parallel ridge, moving through scrub oak and loose stone with the silent coordination of wolves who have hunted together so many times that communication has become unnecessary, Abdul Rahman leads his strike force into position. He has ridden through the night. His horse is exhausted, its flanks dark with sweat, its breathing heavy. But the animal moves forward because the hand on the reins communicates urgency with every subtle motion, and horses, like soldiers, will give what their masters demand until there is nothing left to give. Abdulrahman dismounted his men 2 hours ago. leaving the horses in a concealed hollow, with handlers who understand that silence is not merely preferable but essential. Since then, they have moved on foot, carrying only their swords and their bows and the unshakable conviction that what they are about to do is not merely a military operation but an act of sacred obligation. Abdul Rahman reaches the ridgeline and looks down into the valley of Sarihan, and what he sees confirms everything the scouts reported. The road below passes through a natural bottleneck where the two ridges come closest together, separated by no more than 50 paces of flat ground. The road runs through this bottleneck like a thread through the eye of a needle, and on either side the slopes rise steeply, covered with boulders and brush that provide perfect concealment for men who know how to use them. It is, Abdul Rahman thinks, as though the Almighty himself carved this valley for the specific purpose of giving righteous men a place from which to strike down the unjust. He positions his archers on the eastern ridge, where the morning sun will be behind them, turning them into shadows against the glare while simultaneously blinding anyone on the road who tries to look up and identify the source of the arrows raining down upon them. He positions his swordsmen on the western ridge, lower down, closer to the road, hidden behind boulders that have been sitting in that spot since before the first man ever walked this earth, waiting as boulders wait, with the patience of things that measure time in millennia rather than moments. And he takes his own position at the narrowest point of the bottleneck, on a ledge that overlooks the road from a height of perhaps 30 feet, close enough to see the faces of the men below, close enough to read the insignia on their armor, close enough to choose his targets with the deliberation of a man who understands that in this kind of engagement, precision is more valuable than force. He touches the stone beneath his armor. He thinks of Alina. He thinks of her face growing smaller as the boat carried her away from the shore. He thinks of her voice saying, "Avenge my father." And he thinks of the Sultan's words echoing in his memory with the authority of divine command, "Bring our people home." Then he waits. The convoy enters the valley. From above, it looks like an armored serpent sliding through a stone channel, its scales glinting in the early light, its body undulating with the rhythm of horses and wheels. The outriders come first, two men on swift horses whose eyes scan the ridgelines with professional suspicion. They see nothing. The archers are invisible against the glare. The swordsmen are motionless behind their boulders. The morning is still and quiet except for the bird song that threads through the air like a promise of peace that the next few minutes will violently revoke. Behind the outriders comes the advance guard, a dozen men on foot carrying shields and spears, their formation tight, their steps measured. Behind them comes the prisoner cart, heavy and slow, its wooden wheels grinding against the stones of the road with a sound like teeth being clenched. Behind the cart comes the main body of the escort, 30 men at least, their armor well maintained, their weapons sharp, their discipline evident in the precise spacing between each soldier. And behind them, bringing up the rear, rides the Byzantine captain on his warhorse, his eyes fixed forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword with the easy familiarity of a man who has drawn that blade in anger more times than he can count. Abdul Rahman watches them enter the bottleneck. He watches the outriders pass through without incident. He watches the advance guard follow. He watches the prisoner cart roll into the narrowest part of the passage, its wooden frame groaning as it passes between the two ridges, the sound amplified by the stone walls on either side until it sounds like the moan of a creature in pain. And then he gives the signal. The first arrow falls from the eastern ridge like a sliver of divine judgment, and it strikes the lead outrider between the shoulder blades, with such force that the iron head emerges from his chest in a spray of red mist. The man topples from his horse without a sound, dead before his body reaches the ground, and the horse, suddenly unburdened, rears and screams and bolts forward through the narrows, its panic transmitting itself to every other animal in the convoy with the speed of fire through dry grass. The second arrow follows a heartbeat later, and the second outrider joins the first on the ground, his hands clawing at the shaft protruding from his throat, his eyes wide with the particular surprise of a man who has been trained to watch for danger and who has nonetheless failed to see it coming. And then the sky falls. Arrows descend upon the convoy in waves, each wave timed to land a breath after the previous one, creating a continuous rain of steel-tipped death that turns the air inside the bottleneck into something approaching solid matter. The advance guard raises their shields, but the arrows come from above and behind and from angles that shield formations were never designed to counter. Men fall, men scream. Men try to run and find that the road ahead is blocked by the rearing, panicking horses of the fallen outriders. Men try to retreat and find that the men behind them are pressing forward, unable to see what is happening at the front, creating a crush of armored bodies that becomes a trap more effective than any wall. The Byzantine captain reacts with the speed and clarity that earned him his commission. He roars orders that cut through the chaos like a blade through cloth, form up around the cart, shields overhead, archers return fire, but his archers cannot return fire because they cannot see their targets. The sun is in their eyes. The enemy archers are shadows against the blinding glare of dawn. They loose arrows blindly upward, and their shafts fly into the empty sky like prayers offered to a god who is not listening. And when they fall back to earth, they fall among their own men, adding to the carnage rather than alleviating it. And then Abdul Rahman descends. He comes down from the ledge like a hawk folding its wings into a stoop, his sword drawn, his body angled forward, the momentum of his descent adding terrible force to the first stroke he delivers as his feet touch the road. The blade takes the nearest soldier across the throat, and the man's head tilts backward on a neck that has been severed to the vertebrae, and a fountain of arterial blood sprays upward and outward, painting Abdul Rahman's face and armor in the crimson war paint of the righteous. He does not pause, he does not hesitate. He moves through the disintegrating formation like a fire moves through a field of dry wheat, each stroke economical, each kill instantaneous, each step carrying him closer to the prisoner cart where Fatima and Avronos wait with their hands gripping the wooden slats and their hearts hammering against their ribs. Swordsmen pour down from the western ridge behind him, pouring from behind their boulders like water breaking through a dam, their war cries filling the valley with a sound that is not entirely human, a sound that owes more to the primal howl of predators closing on prey than to anything that language can adequately describe. They hit the convoy's flank with the concentrated force of a battering ram, and the formation, already shattered by the arrow storm, disintegrates entirely. What follows is not a battle. It is a slaughter conducted with surgical precision by men who have trained for this moment, and who execute their training with the mechanical perfection of a clockwork mechanism that has been wound to its maximum tension and released. The Byzantine captain fights. Credit must be given where it is due. He fights with the courage and skill of a man who has no intention of surviving this engagement, but who intends to sell his life at the highest possible price. He rallies a knot of soldiers around the prisoner cart and forms a defensive ring, their shields locked, their spears bristling outward, and for a few minutes that seem like hours, this small formation holds against the tide. Abdul Rahman loses men trying to breach it. 3 of his swordsmen fall to the captain's spear, their bodies crumpling onto the blood-soaked road like puppets whose strings have been simultaneously cut. The captain is skilled. The captain is brave. The captain is everything that a soldier should be. But the captain is not Abdul Rahman. Abdul Rahman circles the defensive ring like a wolf circling a flock that has drawn itself into a tight ball of wool and horns. He studies the formation. He identifies the weakest point, the place where the shields overlap imperfectly, because one of the soldiers holding them has taken an arrow in the shoulder, and his arm is beginning to tremble with the effort of maintaining his position. And when Abdul Rahman moves, he moves with a speed that seems to violate the fundamental laws that govern the relationship between mass and velocity. A speed that owes nothing to physical conditioning and everything to the absolute, burning certainty that failure is not merely unacceptable but inconceivable. He hits the weak point in the shield wall like a stone hurled from a siege engine, and the wall breaks. The wounded soldier goes down. The soldiers on either side of him stagger. And through the gap pours Abdul Rahman, his sword a continuous arc of light and blood, each stroke flowing into the next with the fluid grace of a calligrapher writing sacred text on parchment made from the skin of his enemies. He kills 3 men in the space of 2 heartbeats. He kills 2 more before the echo of their comrades' death screams has faded from the valley walls. And then he is face to face with the Byzantine captain, and between them stands only the width of 2 swords and the immeasurable distance between a man who fights for orders and a man who fights for love. The captain lunges. His spear thrust is textbook perfect, aimed at the center of Abdul Rahman's chest, delivered with the full weight of his body behind it. Abdul Rahman does not parry. He does not dodge. He does something that the captain has never seen in all his years of warfare, something that belongs not to the vocabulary of military training but to the vocabulary of faith. He steps forward into the thrust, turning his body at the last possible instant so that the spearhead passes through the gap between his arm and his ribs. And as the captain's momentum carries him forward off balance, committed to a strike that has found nothing but air, Abdul Rahman brings his sword down in a vertical arc that begins at the apex of heaven and ends at the junction of the captain's neck and shoulder. The blow cleaves through armor, through muscle, through bone. The captain falls, and he falls in 2 pieces, and the sound of his body striking the road is the period at the end of a sentence that has been written in blood since the moment the first arrow left the first bowstring on the eastern ridge. The remaining soldiers see their captain fall, and the fight goes out of them like air leaving a punctured waterskin. Some drop their weapons, some try to run. Some simply stand, their arms at their sides, their eyes glazed with the particular emptiness of men who have witnessed something that their minds cannot process and have chosen, as a matter of psychological survival, to stop trying. Abdul Rahman reaches the prisoner cart. His sword is wet from hilt to tip. His face is a mask of red and dust and sweat. His breathing comes in great heaving gulps, each one drawing into his lungs air that tastes of copper and smoke and the particular chemical sweetness that blood releases when it is exposed to the morning sun. He looks at Fatima through the wooden slats and she looks at him, and for a moment neither of them speaks because the moment is too large for speech, too overwhelming for the small, inadequate vessels that words represent. Then Abdul Rahman raises his sword and brings it down on the lock of the cart, and the iron shatters and the door swings open, and Fatima steps out into the light of a morning that she was not sure she would live to see. Abdul Rahman cuts her bonds. He cuts Evronos's bonds. And Fatima, her wrists bleeding where the chains have bitten into her flesh, her face streaked with the dust of captivity, looks at Abdul Rahman and says, "My brother sent you." And Abdul Rahman nods and says, "Your brother sends more than me, Fatima Khatun. He sends the promise that what was taken will be returned, that what was broken will be mended, that those who did this to you will answer for it in a currency they understand, steel and fire and the justice of the Almighty." Evronos, rubbing the feeling back into his hands, looks at the carnage around them, the fallen soldiers, the broken formation, the arrows still quivering in the bodies of the dead, and he says, "We need to move. Yaqid and Difna will have received word by now. Reinforcements will come." Abdul Rahman says, "Horses are waiting in the hollow beyond the western ridge. We ride for the Sultan's position. There is no time for rest and no room for delay." And so they move. They leave the valley of Sarihan behind them, leaving the dead to the silence and the crows that are already gathering on the ridgeline, black shapes against the brightening sky, patient and unhurried, knowing with the certainty of their kind that the feast below is going nowhere, and that the morning is long and the bodies are many and there is plenty for all. The news of the ambush travels fast. It travels on the hooves of a horse ridden by a surviving soldier who escaped the carnage by the simple expedient of hiding beneath the body of a fallen comrade until the fighting stopped, and then crawling into the scrub on his belly like a snake. This soldier rides until his horse collapses beneath him, and then he runs, and then he staggers, and then he crawls the final 50 paces to the outskirts of the camp where Yaqid and Difna have been waiting with the particular impatience of people who expected their prisoners to arrive hours ago. The soldier gasps out his report: the ambush, the arrows from the ridgeline, the swordsmen pouring down like water from the western slope, the captain cut in half by a single stroke, the prisoners freed, the entire escort destroyed. Yaqid listens to this report, and as the words enter his ears, something happens to his face. It is not rage exactly, although rage is certainly part of it. It is not fear, although fear is there too, coiled in his gut like a serpent that has been sleeping and has now been rudely awakened. What passes across Yaqid's face is recognition. The recognition that the web he has been spinning, the intricate construction of betrayal and manipulation and calculated cruelty that he believed would hold him aloft above the consequences of his own nature, has begun to unravel. And when a web unravels, the spider falls. He turns to Difna and his voice is barely controlled, each word squeezed out through a jaw that has been clenched so tightly that the muscles in his cheeks stand out like cords. He says, "They took them. Abdul Rahman intercepted the convoy and took them. All those soldiers, all that preparation, and one man on a ridge with a handful of fighters undid all of it." Difna receives this news with a composure that makes Yaqid's agitation seem all the more extreme by comparison. She says this changes the situation, but it does not destroy it. Shahanshah still holds Damadrias. The Emperor's forces are still committed to our cause. The loss of 2 prisoners, however valuable, does not alter the fundamental balance of power. Orhan's forces are still outnumbered. His position is still precarious. We adapt, we adjust, we continue. But Yaqid shakes his head, and in that motion is the particular violence of a man who is not shaking his head in disagreement, but shaking it in an attempt to dislodge the thoughts that have taken root inside his skull like parasites feeding on his sanity. He says, "You do not understand, Difna. Fatima was the chain that held Evronos. Evronos was the leverage that kept Orhan cautious. Without them, Orhan has nothing to lose. And a man with nothing to lose is a man who will burn the world to ash and stand in the ruins with a smile on his face." Difna considers this, then she says, "Then we must ensure that the world burns in our favor. Come, Shahanshah must be told, and Indriyas, let them decide how the ashes fall." They ride for Damadrias. Behind them, the camp is broken down with the efficiency of men who have learned that staying in one place too long is an invitation to the kind of visit that Abdul Rahman just paid to the convoy in the valley of Sarihan. Tents are folded, fires are extinguished. The apparatus of temporary occupation is dismantled and loaded onto mules, and the column moves. A smaller serpent now, diminished and wary. its outriders ranging far and its rearguard walking backward with their shields raised and their eyes scanning every ridge and every tree line for the flash of steel that might be the last thing they ever see. In Bursa, the morning brings its own revelations. Alina wakes in the chamber that was prepared for her, and for a moment, the space between sleep and consciousness, she does not know where she is. The ceiling above her is not the vaulted stone of her father's palace. The light that enters through the window carries the scent of jasmine and wood smoke rather than the salt of the harbor where she grew up. And then memory returns, all of it, the flight, the boat, the shore where she placed a stone in a man's hand and called him her salvation, and the weight of that memory presses down on her chest until breathing becomes an act of deliberate will rather than unconscious reflex. She rises and goes to the window and looks out over a city that is simultaneously foreign and familiar, a city built by people who pray differently from the way she was taught to pray, but who bleed the same color and grieve the same way and love with the same desperate, irrational intensity that she herself feels every time she thinks of Abdul Rahman's face growing smaller against the shoreline. She stands at the window and watches the city wake, watches the merchants opening their stalls and the women carrying water from the wells and the children chasing each other through streets that have been worn smooth by 1,000 years of human passage, and she thinks, this is where I am now. This is where the current of my life has carried me, and I cannot swim against it. I can only let it carry me and trust that the destination, whatever it is, has been chosen by a wisdom greater than my own. A knock at the door. Uraz enters with food and water and the quiet solicitude of a servant who has been instructed to treat this stranger as family. Alina accepts the offering with gratitude that she expresses not in words but in the softening of her face, in the relaxation of her shoulders, in the almost imperceptible exhale that signals the release of a tension she has been carrying for so long that she had forgotten it was there. Elsewhere in the palace, Nilufar sits in her chamber with the two letters spread before her, and her eyes move back and forth between them as though she is reading a conversation between two versions of the same man, the sultan who commands armies and the man who loves her. And the distance between those two identities is the distance she must navigate every day of her life. The distance between the woman she is in public and the woman she is when the door is closed and the lamp is lit and the letters are the only company she keeps. Malhun Khatan enters without knocking, because between these two women there exists an understanding that predates and supersedes the formalities of protocol. She sits beside Nilufar and says nothing. She simply sits. And in that silence, in the presence of another woman who understands what it means to love a man whose first obligation is not to you, but to an idea larger than any individual life, Nilufar finds something that the letters could not give her. She finds the particular comfort that comes from being understood without explanation, known without exposition, held without being touched. After a long while, Malhun Khatan says he will return. He always returns. And Nilufar says, it is not his return I fear. It is what he will have become by the time he returns. Every war takes a piece of him. Every battle removes something from the man I married and replaces it with something harder, something colder, something that looks at me sometimes as though I am standing on the other side of a river that grows wider with each campaign. I fear the day when the river becomes too wide to cross, Malhun Khatan. I fear the day when he stands on the far bank and cannot find his way back to me. And Malhun Khatan, whose own experience of this particular terror runs deeper and older than anyone in the palace knows, says that is the burden we carry. It is the price we pay for loving men who belong not to us but to history. But listen to me, Nilufar. The river does not grow wider unless we allow it to. Every prayer you offer is a bridge across that water. Every thought you send toward him is a rope thrown from this bank to his. He will find his way back because you will light the shore for him. That is your duty, and it is no less sacred than the duty that takes him to war. Nilufar folds the letters and presses them to her heart, and the tears have dried on her cheeks, and in their place is something that was not there before, something that might be called resolve or acceptance or the particular grace that descends upon those who have stared into the abyss of their own helplessness, and found at the bottom of that abyss a strength they did not know they possessed. Now let us follow the thread of the story to the fortress of Demadrias, where Shahanshah waits in a chamber of imported marble and Byzantine mosaics that depict the victories of emperors whose names the living have forgotten and whose conquests the earth has reclaimed. He sits on a throne that does not belong to him, in a palace that he occupies by the emperor's sufferance rather than by right of conquest, and he waits for the news that his generals will bring him, the news from the field, the news from the forests and the valleys and the roads where the fate of his ambitions is being decided by men with sharper swords and sterner purposes than his own. Indrias arrives first. He enters the chamber with the particular gait of a man who carries bad news and has already rehearsed the most palatable way to deliver it. He kneels before Shahanshah and says, the convoy was ambushed in the valley of Sarihan, the escort was destroyed, the prisoners have been freed. Shahanshah does not react, not immediately. He sits perfectly still on the borrowed throne, his hands resting on the carved armrests, his face as expressionless as the mosaic martyrs who stare down from the walls with eyes made of colored glass and expressions that have not changed in 700 years. Then slowly, like a crack propagating through ice, his composure fractures. His fingers tighten on the armrests. A vein appears on his temple, throbbing with the rhythm of a heart that has suddenly accelerated from the measured pace of a resting ruler to the frantic hammering of a man who sees the edifice of his plans beginning to tilt toward collapse. He says, "Who?" And Indrias says, "Abdul Rahman. He led a strike force through the narrows and hit the convoy from both ridges. The captain fought well, but he was outmatched. Abdul Rahman is, by all accounts, not merely a warrior but something approaching a force of nature." Shahanshah rises from the throne. He walks to the window that overlooks the harbor where Byzantine warships sit at anchor, their sails furled, their rams gleaming in the morning light like the teeth of sleeping predators. He looks out at the sea and says, "Orhan will come now. He will come with everything he has. He has his sister back. He has his general back. He has nothing left to negotiate for and everything to fight for. He will come, and when he comes, he will bring war on a scale that this fortress has never seen." Indrias says, "The fortress is strong, Shahanshah. The walls have withstood siege before. The garrison is well supplied. The emperor's ships control the harbor. Even if Orhan brings his entire army, he cannot breach these defenses without losses that would cripple his forces for a generation." Shahanshah turns from the window, and his eyes carry a light that is not quite madness but is certainly its near neighbor. He says, "You do not understand Orhan Indrias. You have studied him, you have analyzed him. You have mapped his strategies and catalogued his tactics and predicted his movements with commendable accuracy. But you do not understand him. Orhan does not calculate the way we calculate. He does not weigh costs against benefits the way rational men weigh them. He believes, Indrias, he believes with the fervor of a man whose faith is not merely a source of comfort but a source of power, and a man fueled by faith does not recognize the concept of impossible. The word simply does not exist in his vocabulary." He pauses and then continues, his voice dropping to a register that suggests he is speaking not to Indrias but to himself, working through a problem whose solution eludes him no matter how many times he turns it over in his mind. He says, "We must change the terms of the engagement. We must give Orhan a reason to hesitate, a reason to pause at the gates instead of breaking them down. We must find the one thing in this world that would make Orhan stop, and we must place it between him and us like a shield." Indrias says, "And what is the one thing in this world that would make Orhan stop?" And Shahanshah smiles, and the smile is a terrible thing, cold and calculating and utterly devoid of the warmth that smiles are supposed to contain. He says, "The one thing that would make Orhan stop is the one thing he values above victory. His people, his civilians, his women and children and elderly, the non-combatants who live in the villages between here and his advancing army. If those villages were threatened, if those people were in danger, Orhan would divert his forces to protect them. He would split his army, he would weaken his siege, he would give us exactly what we need, which is time. Time for the emperor's reinforcements to arrive, time for the noose to tighten around Orhan's neck instead of ours." Indrias considers this. The strategist in him recognizes the tactical merit of the proposal. The remnant of the human being that still exists somewhere beneath the strategist recoils from the implications. Threatening civilians, using innocents as shields. It is the tactic of the desperate, the strategy of the cornered, the last resort of men who have exhausted every other option and who are willing to abandon the final boundary that separates warfare from atrocity. He says, "If we do this and Orhan discovers our hand in it, every neutral lord between here and Constantinople will turn against us. The emperor himself may withdraw his support. The political cost could be catastrophic." And Shahanshah says, "The political cost of losing is annihilation, Indrias. There is no cost higher than that. Do it. Send the raiding parties, let the villages burn, and let Orhan choose between his army and his people." The order is given, and with that order the war transforms from a conflict between armies into something darker, something that stains not only the ground on which it is fought but the souls of the men who fight it. The line between warrior and monster blurs. The distinction between strategy and savagery dissolves. And the world, which has already endured so much blood and so much betrayal, braces itself for a new chapter of suffering written in the ink of burning villages and the screams of people who never asked to be part of anyone's war. Abdul Rahman rides hard toward the Sultan's position, Fatima and Evronos flanking him on horses commandeered from the fallen escort. They ride without speaking because the wind of their passage snatches words from their lips before they can be heard, and because the urgency of their mission allows for no expenditure of energy on anything except the act of riding itself. Fatima rides like the warrior's daughter she is, her body low over the horse's neck, her hands steady on the reins, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the dust of the Sultan's advancing army rises against the sky like a pillar of cloud sent to guide the faithful through the wilderness of their enemies' intentions. Evronos rides beside her, and his mind, freed from the cage of captivity, has already begun to function in the mode that has made him one of the most formidable military minds of his generation. He is analyzing terrain as they pass through it. He is noting defensive positions, water sources, lines of communication, choke points where a small force could hold a large one, open ground where cavalry could maneuver, dead ground where infantry could assemble unseen. His eyes move ceaselessly, cataloging everything they see, filing every observation in the vast archive of tactical knowledge that occupies his consciousness like a second soul. They reach the Sultan's vanguard by midday. The sentries recognize Abdul Rahman and wave the riders through without challenge, and they gallop through the ranks of the advancing army, past columns of infantry marching with the stolid patience of men who have been told that their destination is a battle, and who have accepted this information with the same equanimity with which they would accept information about the weather, past cavalry units whose horses prance and snort with the nervous energy of animals that can smell what lies ahead, past supply wagons laden with arrows and food and the portable forges that will repair damaged weapons in the field, past field hospitals where physicians arrange their instruments on cloth-covered tables with the methodical calm of men who know that their work will begin when everyone else's is done. They reach the Sultan's command position, a slight rise overlooking a plain that stretches toward the distant silhouette of the fortress of Demadrias, and the Sultan is there, surrounded by his commanders, studying a map that has been spread over a table made from a door torn from a ruined farmhouse. He looks up as they approach, and when his eyes find Fatima, something passes across his face that he quickly suppresses, but that those who know him well can identify as relief so profound it borders on physical sensation. Fatima dismounts and walks toward her brother and he toward her, and they meet in the space between the table and the horses, and for a moment the Sultan is not a sultan. He is a brother. He takes Fatima's hands and examines her wrists where the chains have left their marks, and his jaw tightens and his eyes harden, and the brother disappears and the Sultan returns, and the Sultan is angry. The Sultan is beyond angry. The Sultan has entered the cold, crystalline realm of fury that lies on the far side of rage, the place where emotion ceases to be a hindrance and becomes a fuel source of infinite capacity. He says they will pay every mark on your skin, every hour of your captivity, every indignity you suffered, they will pay for it, not in gold, not in territory, not in treaties and concessions. They will pay in the only currency that justice recognizes: blood. Fatima says, "My Sultan, my brother, there is something you must know. Shahanshah is not merely desperate. He is dangerous in the way that cornered animals are dangerous, the way that men who have nothing left to lose become more lethal than men who have everything to fight for. He spoke of things in my hearing that suggest he is willing to cross lines that even his own allies would consider unconscionable. Be careful, be wary. The enemy you face is not the enemy you have faced before. This enemy has been stripped of everything except his capacity for destruction, and that makes him the most dangerous enemy of all." The Sultan nods. He has already reached this conclusion himself, through the particular intuition that great commanders develop through years of reading not only maps and intelligence reports but the subtler text written in the behavior of their enemies, the hesitations, the sudden movements, the decisions that seem irrational until you understand the desperation that motivates them. He turns to Evronos and says, "Welcome back, Commander. Are you fit to serve?" And Evronos, standing straight despite the exhaustion that shows in every line of his body, says, "I have been calculating our approach to Demadrias since the moment Abdul Rahman cut my bonds. The fortress is strong, but it has a weakness. Every fortress has a weakness. I will find it. Give me a day and access to your scouts, and I will find the crack in those walls through which we can pour the fury of everything they have awakened." The Sultan says, "You have until dawn." And then he turns to Abdul Rahman and says, "You have performed a service today that surpasses anything I could have asked or expected. The honor of this rescue belongs to you. And when this war is over, when the dust settles and the blood dries and the historians sharpen their pens to record what happened here, your name will be among the first they write." Abdul Rahman bows his head and says nothing, because the stone against his chest says everything for him, its warmth a reminder of the woman who placed it there, the woman who is even now sitting at a window in Bursa watching a city that is not her own, and trusting a man she has known for days with the entirety of her fractured, resilient, unbreakable heart. And the army moves forward. It moves toward the fortress. It moves toward the confrontation that will determine whether the walls of Demadrias stand or fall, whether Shahanshah survives or perishes, whether the order of the world as it has been known for generations will continue or be replaced by something new, something forged in the fire of this conflict, something that carries the mark of every sacrifice and every betrayal and every act of courage that has brought it into being. Afternoon sun hangs heavy in the sky, a disk of molten copper suspended above a landscape that has been fought over so many times that the soil itself is more bone than earth. The Sultan raises his hand, and the army halts, and for a moment the only sound is the wind and the distant crash of waves against the base of the cliffs, below the fortress, and the breathing of 10,000 men who stand on the edge of something that will consume some of them, and transform the rest into either victors or ghosts. Somewhere in the distance, smoke rises from a village, then another, then a third. The raiding parties that Shahanshah ordered have begun their work, and the sky to the north fills with columns of black smoke that rise like accusations against the blue, each column representing a home destroyed, a life disrupted, a family scattered to the winds of war. The Sultan sees the smoke, his commanders see it, the army sees it, and a murmur passes through the ranks, a sound that begins as surprise and hardens into something colder, something that has edges and weight and the potential to cut through anything it touches. The soldiers see the smoke and they understand what it means. They understand that the enemy has chosen to fight not with honor but with terror, not against warriors but against the defenseless, not on the battlefield but in the places where children sleep and women bake bread and old men sit in the shade telling stories about a past that was supposed to guarantee a better future. And the Sultan speaks. He does not shout, he does not need to. His voice carries across the silent ranks with the clarity of a bell struck in an empty cathedral, each word falling upon the ears of his men with the precision of a master archer's arrows. He says, they burn our villages because they cannot face our swords. They threaten our families because they cannot withstand our charge. They have shown you who they are, they have shown you what they are willing to do. And now I ask you, will you show them who we are? The answer comes not in words, but in the sound of 10,000 swords being drawn simultaneously, the collective whisper of steel leaving leather that fills the air with a promise that cannot be broken and a threat that cannot be survived. The Sultan nods, he draws his own sword. He turns his horse toward the fortress that squats on the ridge like a stone beast watching its doom approach. And behind him, stretching across the plain like a tide of iron and faith and fury, his army moves. The war continues, the smoke rises, the swords are drawn. In history, that patient, merciless chronicler dips its pen in the ink of what is to come, and prepares to write the next chapter in letters of fire and blood, letters that will burn through the parchment and into the memory of every generation that follows, letters that will never fade, never dim, never be forgotten, because what happens next? What happens when the unstoppable force of righteous fury meets the immovable object of desperate tyranny? What happens when men who fight for faith collide with men who fight for survival is the kind of story that does not merely record history but becomes history itself. The fortress waits, the army advances. The sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that mirror the colors of the battle to come. And no one who stands upon that plain, no sultan, no soldier, no commander, no spy, no traitor, no captive, no woman watching from a distant window with letters pressed against her heart, none of them knows how the story ends. They know only that it does not end here. Not yet. Not tonight. The war is far from over, the forest breathes with fear tonight. Every shadow between the ancient oaks carries the scent of betrayal, and somewhere beneath the canopy where moonlight cannot reach, a man runs as though the earth itself is splitting open beneath his feet. He is the chieftain who stood beside Darsan, the one who pledged his sword and his honor to a cause that was never righteous, and now that cause has crumbled like dry clay in a closing fist. He runs with the desperation of a man who knows that the darkness will not save him, that the trees will not hide him, that every breath he draws might be his last. His eyes dart to the right, scanning the blackness between the trunks, then to the left where the undergrowth rustles with things unseen. He looks ahead where the path vanishes into nothingness, and then behind where the sound of pursuit echoes like the drumbeat of his own failing heart. He stumbles over roots and stones, his armor clanking against his ribs, his cloak caught on branches that seem to reach for him like skeletal fingers. He believes, in this moment of absolute terror, that if he can reach the river, if he can cross the water before dawn, he will live to see another sunrise. He believes he can outrun justice. He is wrong. Because from the darkness ahead, from the very direction he runs toward with every ounce of his remaining strength, a hand emerges and strikes him across the face with such force that his feet leave the ground. The crack of the blow echoes through the forest like the snap of a war drum, and the chieftain crashes into the earth, his jaw singing with pain, his vision swimming with stars that have no place among the trees. And standing above him, immovable as a mountain, his chest heaving not from exertion but from rage barely contained, is Daimir Khan. His soldiers materialize from the shadows like wolves emerging from the treeline, and before the fallen chieftain can draw breath to scream, they seize him. They pin his arms behind his back. they force his face into the dirt. And Damir Khan looks down at this wretch, this crawling insect who once called himself a warrior, and his voice comes low and terrible, carrying the weight of every trust that has ever been broken since the beginning of time. He says, "How did you imagine you could run from me? How did that thought even form in your miserable mind? Stop your screaming, traitor. Silence your tongue before I remove it from your mouth." And then Damir Khan's voice changes. It drops lower, and in that lower register there is something worse than anger. There is grief. There is the particular agony of a man who invested years of faith in another human being only to watch that investment turn to ash. He says, "I trusted you. Do you understand what that means? I trusted you with my plans, with my soldiers, with the safety of my blood, and you repaid that trust by conspiring with Orhan. You crawled to his feet like a dog seeking a new master." With those words still hanging in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, Damir Khan falls upon the chieftain. His fists rise and fall with the rhythm of a blacksmith's hammer, each blow punctuated by words torn from somewhere deep within his chest. "You betrayed your own chieftain. You betrayed your own kinsmen. You spat upon the bonds of blood that held us together." The chieftain tries to speak through his shattered lips, tries to form words around broken teeth, and he manages to gasp out a single defiant phrase. He says, "And you betrayed our faith and our blood by siding with infidels. You worked hand in hand with those who would see our people enslaved. You sold our honor for alliance with Kafirs." Damir Khan pauses. His bloodied fist hovers in the air, and for a moment, just a moment, something flickers across his face. Not doubt, never doubt, but recognition. Recognition that this worm beneath his boot has touched a nerve that runs deeper than politics, deeper than strategy, deeper than the endless game of power that consumes them all. But the moment passes and Damir Khan straightens himself, his knuckles dripping crimson onto the forest floor. He looks at the broken chieftain and speaks with the measured calm of a man pronouncing a sentence from which there is no appeal. He says, "I taught you how to take life and how to give it. I taught you the ways of the sword and the ways of command, but I could not teach you politics. I could not teach you wisdom. I could not make you understand that loyalty is not a garment you change with the seasons. And now I will teach you one final lesson, a lesson you will carry into the grave." And his fist falls again. Far from that blood-soaked clearing in the forest, the world takes on a different character entirely. The shore stretches out silver and endless under the stars, and the sea whispers against the sand with the patience of something that has watched civilizations rise and fall without ever caring which flag flew above which city. Abdulrahman stands at the water's edge, and beside him stands Alina, and between them hangs a silence so heavy with unspoken feeling that the air itself seems to bend beneath its weight. Abdulrahman turns to her, and his voice carries the softness that only those who have seen true courage in another person can summon. He says, "What you did, Alina, what you accomplished, it was no small thing. It was an act of extraordinary courage. But tell me, did you do this only for your father?" Alina does not answer immediately. She looks out at the dark water where the waves fold over themselves in endless repetition, and when she speaks, her voice carries the tremor of someone sharing a secret they have held close to their heart for longer than they can remember. She says, "It was because of a dream, Abdulrahman, a dream that would not release me." Abdulrahman's brow furrows slightly. He says, "A dream," and Alina nods, and the words begin to flow from her like water finding its way through stone. She says, "For 1 full year I saw the same vision every time I closed my eyes. I was in a pit. A deep, dark pit with walls of black stone that stretched upward into nothingness. Every time I tried to climb, my hands would slip. Every time I found a foothold, it would crumble beneath me. I would fall back into the darkness again and again and again, and I would wake with my heart pounding and my sheets soaked with sweat and the taste of despair on my tongue. For 1 year, Abdulrahman, the same pit. The same darkness, the same fall." She pauses, and when she continues, her voice has changed. There is light in it now, the kind of light that comes not from torches or lanterns, but from somewhere inside the human soul that no darkness can reach. She says, "But last night, for the first time, something was different. The stone you gave me, the stone I had placed aside, thinking it was just a trinket, a curiosity, it appeared in my hand as I stood at the bottom of the pit, and it blazed. Abdulrahman, it blazed with a light so fierce that the walls of the pit turned from black to gold, and every shadow fled before it like rats fleeing a fire. And then I saw you. You were standing at the rim of the pit, looking down at me, and you reached your hand toward me, and when I took it, you pulled me out. You lifted me from that abyss as though I weighed nothing, as though the year of falling and failing and despairing had been nothing more than a preparation for that single moment of rescue. And when I woke, the stone was in my hand, not on the shelf where I had placed it, in my hand, clutched in my fingers as though I had been holding it all along. And I knew with a certainty that transcended reason that this was not merely a dream. This was something more, something ordained, something written in a book whose pages we cannot see but whose words we feel in the marrow of our bones." As she speaks these final words, she takes the stone from around her neck and places it in Abdulrahman's palm, and her fingers close his hand around it, and she looks into his eyes and says, "You are my deliverer. You are the one who pulled me from the darkness. You are my salvation, Abdulrahman." He stands there, feeling the weight of the stone in his palm, feeling the warmth of her fingers around his, and something moves in his chest that he has no words for, something vast and terrifying and beautiful all at once. He lifts the stone to the starlight and watches it catch the glow of distant constellations, and when he speaks, his voice is barely above a whisper, but it carries across the water as though the sea itself has chosen to amplify it. He says, "Just as this stone illuminated the pit in which you were trapped, so you are illuminating the darkness in which I have walked. You are turning my shadows into light, Alina. Every darkness I have carried, every doubt, every wound that refused to heal, you are burning them away simply by being who you are." He pauses, and when he continues, his voice firms with the resolution of a man about to ride towards something from which he may not return. He says, "I am leaving now. I go to fulfill a duty that cannot wait, a duty that may demand everything I have and everything I am. But know this, you will be in my thoughts at every moment. When I draw my sword, it will be your face I see on the blade. When I speak my prayers before battle, it will be your name that rises with the smoke of the incense. You will be with me, Alina, in every heartbeat and every breath until we meet again." And Alina, standing there with the sea breeze moving through her hair, says with a simplicity that strips all pretense from the moment, "And you will always be in my thoughts, Abdul Rahman, always, until the end of all things and beyond." Abdul Rahman turns to Contrali, who has been standing at a respectful distance, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the first faint suggestion of dawn touches the edge of the world. And Abdul Rahman says to him, "Take care of her, Contrali. Guard her as you would guard your own soul." Contrali nods, the weight of the charge settling onto his shoulders like a suit of armor, and he begins to lead Alina toward the boat that waits at the water's edge, its sail folded against the mast like a sleeping bird's wing. But as Alina steps onto the sand that gives way to the shallow water where the boat sits, she turns back, and her voice, cutting through the sound of the waves, carries a request that is not truly a request but a command issued from the deepest chamber of a grieving daughter's heart. She says, "Avenge my father, Abdul Rahman. Make them answer for what they did to him. Make them pay in the only currency they understand." Abdul Rahman does not speak. He does not need to. The look in his eyes says everything that words could never adequately express. He watches as she boards the vessel, watches as Contrali pushes off from the shallows, watches as the sail unfurls and catches the wind and the boat begins to move away from the shore. And Alina, standing at the stern with her hand gripping the rail, looks back at him. She looks back again and again, her face growing smaller with distance, but her gaze never wavering, never breaking, as though she is trying to memorize the shape of him against the coastline, as though she knows, with the intuition that only those who truly love possess, that the next time she sees him, the world will have changed irrevocably, and neither of them will be the same people they are in this moment. The boat diminishes into the darkness, the sea takes it, and Abdul Rahman stands alone on the shore with the stone in his hand and the weight of a promise settling into his bones like iron. Now the scene shifts, and the air changes from salt and sea spray to dust and chains and the bitter taste of captivity. Fatima and Evronos are being transported under heavy guard, their wrists bound, their faces bearing the marks of rough handling, and around them the soldiers of the enemy move with the mechanical efficiency of men who have learned to treat prisoners not as human beings but as cargo. Cargo to be delivered. Cargo to be presented before their master like tribute from a conquered land. Difna walks beside Andreas, her voice low and conspiratorial, carrying the particular intimacy of two people who share a darkness that binds them more tightly than any love ever could. She says, "We must remain cautious regarding Yakid, my beloved Ahmed Kashik. He is unpredictable. He is driven by passions that cloud his judgment, and a man driven by passion is a man who can be neither trusted nor controlled." Andreas nods slowly, his eyes fixed on the distance where the dust of the convoy rises against the gray sky. He says he is still consumed by his obsession with Fatima. He cannot see past her. He cannot think beyond her. And that blindness will be the chain around all our necks if we do not manage it carefully. As they speak, Shahanshah steps forward to observe the prisoners, and his gaze falls upon Evronos and Fatima with the cold assessment of a man examining pieces on a game board. And he speaks not to them directly at first, but to the air around them as though addressing fate itself. He says, "A man is not imprisoned by walls and chains. A man is imprisoned by his own wrong choices. Look at yourself, Fatima Katan. Look at where your choices have brought you. You chose defiance. You chose rebellion. You chose to stand against the natural order of things. And now you stand in the prison that your own hands built, stone by stone, decision by decision, until the walls rose so high that not even the sunlight could reach you." Fatima lifts her chin. The chains rattle as she draws herself up to her full height, and when she speaks, her voice carries the authority of a woman who has never once in her life lowered her eyes before any man, be he sultan or emperor or god walking upon the earth. She says, "My father and my brother saved your life more times than you can count, Shahanshah. They pulled you from the jaws of death when all others had abandoned you. They shed their blood so that your blood might continue to flow through your veins. Is this how you repay that debt? Is this what you consider me worthy of? Chains and cages and the mockery of men who are not fit to polish the boots my father wore. Know this, Shahanshah, you will answer for this. You will answer in this world and in the world that comes after. There is a reckoning that no army can defend against, and it is coming for you." Shahansh's expression does not change. He has heard threats before. He has heard the curses of the dying and the defiance of the condemned, and none of it has ever altered the trajectory of his ambition by so much as a single degree. He says, "You brought this upon yourself, Fatima. I wanted to make you my daughter-in-law. I wanted to welcome you into my house, into my family, to honor you as a daughter of my own blood. But you chose that dog standing beside you. That worthless creature who could offer you nothing but shame and ruin. He was all you deserved." And at these words, Yakid steps forward, his face alight with the vicious pleasure of a man who has waited years for this moment. He says, "Yes, this dog, this same dog who lied to your face again and again, who humiliated you before everyone, who made you a spectacle of ridicule in every court from here to the eastern mountains. This dog, Fatima, is the one you chose over honor, over dignity, over everything that might have saved you." Vrono strains against his chains, the muscles in his arms standing out like ropes beneath his skin, and his voice comes out as a growl, low and savage, the sound of a man who has been pushed beyond the last boundary of his patience. He says, "Yakid, listen to me carefully, because I will only say this once. When I am free, and I will be free, I will beat you so terribly that the generations yet unborn will tell the story of what I did to you. They will speak of it around their fires. They will sing of it in their songs. Your suffering will become a legend, Yakid, and it will be a legend that never ends." Yakid laughs. It is not a genuine laugh. It is the brittle, hollow sound of a man who knows, somewhere beneath his bravado, that the words he just heard carry the weight of prophecy. But he masks his unease with cruelty, as he always does, and he says, "First, let us go before Shahanshah and tell him everything about Orhan's battle plans. If you lie, you will die there, and if you speak the truth, your death is equally certain. There is no road left for you, Flavios. Every path leads to the same destination, the grave." Shahanshah, observing this exchange with the detached interest of a man watching insects struggle in a jar, adds his own contribution to the torment. He says, "If you speak the truth, Flavios, perhaps Fatima Khatun's life might be spared. Consider that. Consider what your stubbornness costs not only you but the woman who stands beside you. Is your pride worth her life?" The words hang in the air like the blade of an executioner's axe, suspended at the apex of its arc, waiting to fall. But before the full weight of that threat can settle, the world shifts again, back to the forest, where Damir Khan raises his sword above the kneeling chieftain and speaks the final words that a condemned man hears before the steel descends. He says, "A chieftain's strength is equal to his wisdom, and your wisdom, such as it is, merits nothing but death. Read the Kalima, make your peace with the Almighty, for you will meet him shortly." The blade catches the moonlight, it rises, it prepares to fall. And then from behind, a voice cuts through the darkness with the precision of an arrow finding its mark. It says, "You cannot be a chieftain." Damir Khan freezes. His arm remains raised, the sword trembling slightly in his grip, and he turns slowly to face the source of that voice. And there stands Darsan, not the Darsan of old, not the younger brother who lived in his elder's shadow, not the subordinate who accepted orders with bowed head and bitten tongue. This is a different man. This Darsan stands flanked by Mustafa and a contingent of soldiers whose loyalty is written in the steel they carry and the resolve in their eyes. This Darsan carries himself with the bearing of command, and when he continues to speak, his words fall like hammer blows upon an anvil. Darsan says, "And even if you had become chieftain, you could never have ruled